Chapter 421. The Tower Sage. The Tower Sage gently marched into his receiving chamber, sort of like a lobby. The interior was marked with soft, exquisite chairs, with an aura of majesty that accentuated the aura of this man. On the single and lead chair in the room was seated a young handsome man. His eyes were fierce and shaped like the gaze of an eagle. His hair was ashen white, and his face, although angular, was brimming with charm. He raised his striking maroon eyes as the Tower Sage bowed before him, softly greeting. "Your Highness! Gilliver, take a seat. I have some pending matters to discuss with you." The prince gestured his hand towards the two-seat couch on his right-hand side. As requested, even though it was his chambers, the Tower Sage, Gilliver, moved towards the prince and sat exactly where he was asked to. The prince wore a gentle smile upon his face as the two of them dined in silence for a couple of minutes. His demeanor was soft and graceful, and Gilliver was well composed in front of him, a testament to the kind of authority and respect the prince commanded. The prince finally opened his mouth and spoke. "Andre entered some kind of business with the outsiders. Were you aware of it?" With unchanging calmness, Gilliver responded, "Yes, Your Highness, not directly. He even made number 10 and number 9 do his bidding. Were you aware of that also? I tried to inform His Majesty about that, but the Emperor cared too little about what you guys are up to." Prince Razakar sighed and leaned into the couch, his hands elegantly resting on the armrest. He spoke in exasperation. "I can feel my family and everything that held us together breaking apart. Our father sees us as enemies, and my two brothers are contacting outsiders just to do their bidding. The sad part of all of this is, I don't even know what they are doing." He paused as he strained his voice, breathing gently before he continued. "You, Gilliver." He matched his eyes with the Tower Sage's. "You know everything. You can help me save my family." The Tower Master, for once since their conversation started, raised his eyes confidently, looked into the eyes of the prince, and retorted. "As a member of the Tower, I have a responsibility that does not conform to the will of the Imperium, but rather matters to the Empire at large. The Tower serves and protects the people and the imperial family. You say that, and yet you hawk over my aunt every moment. You protect and shield her from our disputes. You think I would never know?" The prince's voice, although subtly, was growing irritated. Gilliver faltered, but he suppressed the slight anxiety in his face and responded without any visible attachment. Not on his face nor his voice. "Lady Hinai deserves better. She is a core important part of this empire. My responsibility as much as every other citizen is." The prince chuckled, relaxed, and pointed a finger towards the Tower Sage. "You, Gilliver, are one smart man. You are just doing the same thing that your other brothers and father have tried to do to me. Win me over to your sides. But there's a reason why the Tower has never taken sides. Not even the Emperor's. The Tower is an independent principality in this nation. Please leave us out of your family war." Prince Razakar smiled and tapped the armrest softly, smacking his lips as he conceded with the Tower Master's words. "Okay, Gilliver, okay. I like your determination. I just wanted to be sure that your mind is not changing. New tides are rushing towards us. I am sure of it. Something is going to happen soon, and we need to brace ourselves for it. While Father is caught up in this solitary rift training to break through the limitations of a paragon and become a luminary, and my two brothers are more focused on the throne than the actual nation itself, it is left to me, the first prince, and you to protect this land." Gilliver bowed his head and said, "Be rest assured, Your Highness, should there be any situation that poses danger to the nation as a whole, I will step in without a second thought because that is the purpose of the Tower." With that, the prince nodded in agreement and stood up. His brilliant face broke out in a sincere smile once again. But behind those calm eyes was a suppressed maroon demon. The Tower Sage smiled and saw the prince out as he walked away. On getting to the entrance, the prince stopped and turned back, saying, "Oh, and I heard there was commotion at the gate. I never imagined that monsters would make it this far, under the oversight of your tower." Gilliver bowed his head deeply. "The matter has been resolved as we speak. Prince Razakar smiled and nodded. Of course, my dear Gwyll. You are a very capable young man. With the final word, he left the chamber. Immediately after he did, the tower sage, Gilliver, heaved a sigh, almost as if his heart had wanted to pop out all this while. The atmosphere commanded by the prince was no joke. If he had shown just a slight weakness, the prince would have hammered further than he did and perhaps even gone to extremes. Of course, this was the kind of thing Gilliver had to endure daily because he chose not to side with any of the imperial family in their feud, save only Lady Hinai, whom he swore to protect due to her lineage, delicacy, and importance. Of course, there was more to that story than Gilliver was ever willing to admit to anyone except himself. He exhaled one more time and suddenly remembered the person he had brought inside. Gilliver went through the door and hastily made his way to the infirmary within the same tower building. He was met by the same knight called Shambles, who greeted with a slight head bow and led him into the room where the boy was. By the time they entered into the infirmary, there was no boy anymore. No one was there. Chapter 422. Northern is missing. Hey! Have you seen Northern today? Ellis tilted his head left and right, thinking for a couple of seconds before responding. Shouldn't I be asking you that? Last I saw him, both of you were walking out. Annette frowned a little bit and nodded her head. Thank you, Ellis, she said and turned away from him. However, before she walked any further, Ellis ran to her front with an inquisitive expression drawing on his face. She already knew what he was going to ask. Nothing is wrong, Ellis. There's no disagreement of any sort. Maybe he's just killing monsters or relaxing somewhere. You know your friend. Ellis's expression relaxed a bit. He let out a sigh and said, I know him. That's exactly why I'm suspecting that something happened between you guys and Lady Raven. Annette observed him for a moment. She frowned slightly as she called to him. I've got a question for you. Ellis looked up to her eyes, confused. Okay, sure. If Raven and Northern end up picking different sides, which side are you following? I mean, it's no news that those two do not like each other. So if it comes down to it, who are you following? Ellis chuckled. Isn't that question something you already know the answer to? Annette raised a brow. So you would follow your lovely Lady Raven? Ellis frowned immediately. What? Hell no. I owe Northern my life. Why would I pick my love for Lady Raven over my loyalty to Northern? When no one saw any good in me, Northern did. He believed in me and still believes in me. I might be nowhere near where he is right now, but with someone as strong as him believing in me, I am sure I too will become a force to reckon with one day. Annette stared at him with respect and amazement. Then a smile whispered out of her face. You are impressive. Keep that good brain of yours. She looked around. Anyway, there's a need for us to find Northern. Things are moving fast. Raven is preparing to invade Lewengard. I need to know what exactly his plan is. Her eyes came back to Ellis. What about Jessie? She woke up a few minutes ago. I can help you ask her. Annette nodded to him. You help me do that. I have to address the people and finally break the nut and tell them the perilous mission we have before us. Ellis looked at her tentatively and called as she walked away. Instructor Anne. Annette looked back without turning. Do you think we can make it back home? She smiled. We won't stop trying until we are home. Then she walked away, her right and left flank seductively swaying as she did. Ellis withdrew his eyes and solemnly made his way to where he last remembered he saw Jessie. It was a small yard behind, somewhere that had been designated as an open space for training. Ellis had seen her walk towards that side earlier before Annette approached him, so he had naturally thought she was going there. A couple of people were sparring here and there in the open space. Despite the toll that the past day had taken on everyone, they seemed energetic. Moreover, Gilbert was also here. He stood towards a corner and seemed to be instructing someone or at least teaching. Maybe explaining. I don't know, what's my business? Ellis grunted away and turned his neck, carefully observing every other person. That was when he saw Jessie opposite a man, grinning menacingly with her spear in her hands. Oh no, that can't be good. Ellis mumbled and hurriedly ran towards the man. He got in between them and spread his arms, facing Jessie. Please don't do this. Jessie frowned. What do you mean? Ellis trembled but summoned the courage to speak. This man is a resource of some sort. We are still trying to find a way home. You can't kill anyone. Jessie's frown deepened, becoming dark and scary. Young boy, what do you mean? I had humbly asked for a spar from this lady because she uses a spear and I can see she is skilled with it. The man raised the rod in his hands. Might not look like it, but I am a spear user also. Ellis blinked a couple of times and awkwardly dropped his hands, scratching the back of his head. Ah, I didn't know that was the case. It was a spar. He slowly took himself from their middle to Jessie's side. Everywhere settled into a few moments of silence. The man then disrupted, his strong voice ringing. Well then, if you wish to continue? Jessie was about to answer. However, Ellis hurriedly interrupted. She can't. He said to the man and quickly faced Jessie. You can't. The man looked at Ellis with a small frown. Kid, that is not your decision to. I can't, Jessie said before he got to finish his statement. This caused the man to grimace towards Jessie, but his anger only lasted a few seconds. He breathed everything out and said in an even tone, Well then, if that is what you want, young lady. He bowed his head barely and walked away. Jessie turned to Ellis immediately, a frown etched upon her brows. Explain yourself, Langer. What did you call me? Ellis questioned with an intense frown, but Jessie's expression was scarier, making him cough softly and answer with humility. So, the thing is, instructor and has been looking for Northern. Immediately the part Northern was mentioned. All of Jessie's demeanor changed. Her eyes widened and trembled. What happened to him? He hasn't been sighted all the while, and Instructor Annette thinks something is wrong. Jessie covered her face with her hand and bent, trembling as if she was in pain. Jessie, are you okay? She stood up with a deep frown. He has gone to Lewengard. Ellis took his head back with a disbelieving frown. Lewengard? Why would he? She turned to look at Ellis with a doleful expression and said, To see his mother. Chapter 423. A Dangerous Girl. Immediately after she gave him that answer, Jessie bolted into motion, briskly moving out of the open area. Ellis was awestruck for a moment, thinking, his mother? He really is a prince of Lewengard. He raised his head and quickly called out, Wait for me! Running after Jessie as fast as he could. Jessie did not respond to him and just ran out of the shelter and into the woods. Raven happened to be by the entrance, just coming in when Jessie bolted out, and Ellis was running towards her, shouting, Wait! She stopped Ellis, grabbing his arm before he could pass her. With a frown, she asked, What is wrong? Ellis exchanged glances between the now gone Jessie and Raven, who was looking at him with a stern gaze, not entirely sure what to do. He hesitated for a moment before answering, Northern is missing. Ellis didn't see any hint of surprise on her face. He didn't think that information affected her anyway. Then he heard her say, Instructor Annette told me about it. Does anyone have an idea where he might be? Ellis' facial expression was puzzled. With the question Annette had asked him and the sensitivity of what Jessie had told him, he didn't want to say anything at all. But Raven looked at him as if she was going to pull those answers out whether he was willing or not. Moreover, he couldn't bear being disrespectful to her. He gulped. Jessie thinks he might have gone to Lewengard. Raven looked down for a moment, then raised her head with a frown. Why would he? Ellis shook his head. I have no idea either. Raven released his hand and sighed. Thank you, Ellis. Ellis' face radiated with the brilliant light of hope. She knows my name. His mind screamed. He watched Raven walk away with the slender and slightly taller Helena beside her. Then he belatedly remembered he was doing something before he got stopped. Right, Jessie. Immediately he dashed out of the shelter. Meanwhile, Annette was inside the main hall of the shelter. The place had gotten quite full, with people seated here and there, even Gilbert, Mew, and Ryu. Just as they settled in, Raven entered, attracting all the attention in the room. There was urgency in her eyes. She stopped in front of the table, all eyes focused on her, and yet she did not shake, not in the slightest. "We need to speed things up and begin moving into Lewingard." Annette frowned and rose up. "Stop it right there, Raven. What is wrong with you?" Raven looked at Annette.
I'm sorry, Instructor Annette.
"I didn't mean any disrespect, but I think an opportunity has been granted, and we need to take it. Why don't you explain this opportunity before coming in here and commanding everyone like we are your damned pawns?" Her tone grew with fire. Raven at that point was silent, calmly looking at Annette's glaring eyes. She lowered her head, her voice ringing out. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect anyone. I just happened to hear that Northern could be in Lewingard Empire." Annette's eyes widened, as did every other person seated at the table. They were all shocked, and not one of them carried an iota of doubt in Raven's words. The reasons were quite obvious. Rather than questioning Northern's capability and craziness, all that was needed was the word from Raven's own mouth. If she believed it, then every one of them did too. How?" Annette stammered. "I'm not sure, but I know the lady following him was one of the knights that was sent to kill us. If she is sure that Northern is going to Lewingard, then he is. Maybe he already made it inside." Annette felt strength leave her legs, and she slumped into her seat. "Damn Northern, that kid." A spiky-haired kid with sharp teeth looked at Raven with a frown and asked, "So, what exactly does he being in Lewingard have to do with us going there now?" His voice sounded with a grunt at every syllabic pause. "Because he would have taken down the gatemen in front of the place." "Won't they replace them immediately?" Annette intoned. "Yes, they will. But those will be temporary replacements. We can take them down before they bring permanent replacements." "Yeah, Raven, I never thought taking out the guards had ever been an issue. Did you?" A small smile played on Raven's lips and immediately faded. "You are right, Instructor Annette." "So?" Annette asked with a slight frown. "Right now, this lady is going after Northern despite knowing the place is an impenetrable fortress." Annette's eyes widened. "Oh my Eldek, you think she might know another way in?" Raven nodded her head at Annette's guess and said, "She'll probably not want any of us to be aware of it. That probably explains why she stormed off without telling anyone." Ellis followed her. "But I don't think he'll make it anyway." Arlem interjected. "What is this lady's deal with Northern anyway? That, right now, is not our business. Right now, I just feel like we need to get moving," Raven said sternly. Annette looked at Arlem, noticing the offense taken in his expression. Then she addressed everyone all together. "Raven is correct. Right now, we can't afford to concern ourselves with trivial matters. I, myself, have been very curious, but we can't afford such luxury." Her eyes drifted towards Raven. "Her plan probably sucks. If Jessie finds out we are using her to enter her country, she'd probably hate us. But what choice do we have? It's either them or us, and we need to go home." Everyone murmured, nodding in agreement with what Annette had said. Confidence and resolve wafted across the room. Annette looked at Raven and asked, "Jessie is probably halfway to Lewingard as we speak. What exactly is your plan on that part?" Raven smiled. "Of course, I'm tailing her already." "Tailing her? How?" Annette's tone rang with surprise. "I'd prefer not to share, but I have familiars around. When one of them saw her pass, I ordered it to follow her. So now, can we at least start moving? 5 people will do." Annette looked at Raven in disbelief and thought, "Damn, this girl is dangerous." Chapter 424. Meeting Mommy, Part 1. Northern breathed as he placed the golden helmet on his head and looked down at the almost naked man who was knocked out cold in a corner. "Full of shine," he whispered in compliment as he observed the armor of gold he was wearing. Every single soldier within the compound was clad in radiant gold armor, so of course, it would be out of place for him to move around in rugged leather armor. Another thing Northern had managed to discover from stealthily observing the palace for the past few hours was that there were different sections. And although every soldier's armor was gold, there was a different pattern to their helmets. And it wasn't even hard to notice. It was the first thing that he caught wind of, in fact. For example, the soldiers from where he was coming had 3 pointed edges like a trident, and their armor was face-revealing. In another place, their golden helmets covered their entire face, and at the edge of the helm was a white, flowing, horsetail-like hair. Another had horns curving towards each other, with their eyes covered and revealing only their face, and there were 2 more distinct ones Northern noticed. Northern moved his hands around for a moment. Good mobility. The main sections of the armor, such as the breastplate, pauldrons, and greaves, were intricately detailed with layered plates, giving it a robust and battle-ready appearance. The gauntlets and boots were equally well-crafted, with segments that allowed for flexibility while maintaining strong protection. The armor's design was both elegant and intimidating, with a modern twist that made it stand out. Northern watched for a couple of seconds and finally set out, walking with the golden spear as if nothing was wrong. The palace was in sections. Each section had its master building that somehow connected to the main pyramid-like building in a strange maze twist, making it especially difficult to navigate at night. But currently, Northern was also using spatial awareness. Since assimilating with a larger part of the void, his spatial awareness had gotten better. He could sense almost everything within a radius of 4 to 200 meters, unless they were masters at stealth themselves. Because in conjunction with his spatial awareness, his heightened senses and danger sense were also acutely functioning. It was very hard for him to miss a thing. Already, Northern could tell the number of soldiers that were roaming around the palace, because he had been here and there in stealth. It was an intentional action because the first thing he wanted to do was have a mental map of the place. He wanted to sense everyone in the palace and segregate them based on the amount of soul essence they were exuding. Even when some were masters at concealing their soul essence, making it seem so little, almost like that of a mundane human, Northern could tell they were hiding it. And there were numerous cases like that. One-on-one, he was confident he could defeat everyone he had noticed so far. But if they were to all gang up on him, it was a different story. But he also thought, I have an army of my own. He smiled shortly and continued forward with his head held straight into the air. After a couple of steps, he cut into a corner and raised his head to the window in the building that could be seen in the backdrop of many walls. The walls were like a maze, as if to make further journey difficult for anyone. Northern paused as he stared at the window, a light with a golden hue even in the midst of the night. He narrowed his eyes and thought to himself, what do I say to her? He had no idea. At this point, he began to feel like turning back would be a better choice. What if she does not recognize me? At the thought of such a possibility, Northern's hand holding the spear trembled. Suddenly, someone interrupted, calling, Hey! What are you doing? Standing like that? Northern staggered as he turned around to face the person calling him. The man was wearing the kind of helmet that covered his face, revealing only his eyes. From the tower. He came closer and stopped in front of Northern. The commander has ordered that we find an intruder. What are you doing here? Northern frowned slightly. I'm sorry, but I am not a part of the tower garrison. The soldier took a step closer, looming over Northern in an intimidating way. Northern couldn't see his whole face, but his eyes were currently glaring with bloodthirst. So because you are a member of the Imperial garrison, you think it's just okay to disobey orders from your superior? Oh, I see. I see what this is. A bully. Northern flashed a small smile and frowned in return. As far as the word superior goes, I have a responsibility to answer to those in my garrison first, before any other. Northern responded with an unintimidated look in his eyes. This caused the other soldier to grow intensely angry, glaring into Northern's eyes. Then he noticed something, and his eyes widened. Blue! Immediately after Northern heard him mutter, he wasted no time and drove a punch into the guy's stomach, blasting a large propulsion of air from his back. The soldier collapsed unconscious, his mouth foaming. Northern swiftly turned around, his feet barely touching the ground, and he dashed away like a gunshot, cutting through different corners of the wall. Finally, he reached the gate where two soldiers were positioned. Before they could see him, he disappeared. Both of them looked at each other because of the sudden wind blow and shrugged. Northern softly landed on the roof of the window and looked down. His heart thumped as he stared. The final step was entering through the window, and then he would get to meet his real birth mother. He gently touched his chest. I had thought this meant nothing to me, so why exactly am I so tense? He steadied his breath and dropped his hands slowly. He closed his eyes and opened them, then walked towards the edge of the roof with feather steps, letting himself fall off. As he fell past the window, taking a good glimpse of the interior, Northern's figure suddenly disappeared. As he appeared out of thin air, Northern's boot softly stepped on the embroidered red rug. The focal point of the room was a large canopy bed, draped in rich, dark curtains with plush, burgundy or deep red bedding. The bed was positioned under an archway, which added to the grandeur and historical feel of the space. The room was framed by stone arches and columns with intricate carvings, contributing to the sense of age and architectural beauty. Candlelight provided a warm, flickering golden glow, enhancing the room's intimate and somewhat mysterious atmosphere. The walls were a deep, earthy tone, likely a rich shade of red or brown, complementing the overall warmth of the room. A few pieces of dark wood furniture could be seen, including what seemed to be a chest or cabinet at the back and possibly a small table to the side. The presence of the ironwork on the bed and the overall design elements suggested a luxurious taste. The combination of the rich colors, candlelight, and heavy fabrics gave the room a cozy yet imposing atmosphere. Northern slowly walked forward after breathing in all the scenery. He stood right next to the bed and frowned. Immediately from behind, a knife was put across his throat. The hands wielding the knife were pale, cold, and bony. They were the first thing he noticed. My mother's hands. The words occurred to him almost like an epiphany. Who sent you? Her voice was thick with a tender undertone. Perhaps she is trying so hard to sound intimidating. Northern couldn't help but smile. Are you Lady Hinai? The lady raised a brow. You should know that very well before sneaking in here. Why are you asking me? Northern chuckled. She's fierce. Suddenly, he vanished from her grasp. Her eyes widened, but immediately he appeared right in front of her, but facing her instead of backing her. Her eyes widened even further as they beheld his face. Her hands began to tremble. Northern frowned at first, thinking, what is wrong with her? She stumbled backward first, then stopped herself. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she wanted to speak but she couldn't. Then her hands slowly stretched forward, her legs following, softly and slowly taking one step after the other. She paused in front of him, taking a tense gulp. Then she moved her hands slowly once again, touching Northern's helmet gently and removing it from his head. The metal cap clanged on the ground with a grudge as she dropped it. She didn't care how disturbing the sound could have been, but it was surely heard by several people. His white hair unfurled and fell down his face immediately after the metal cap was taken off. Her facial expression finally broke into tears. She shook and fell to the ground, looking up at Northern's face. Northern, meanwhile, was observing her with a slight frown etched upon his features, thinking, it can't be. Did she recognize me? Immediately? That's impossible. Chapter 425. Meeting Mommy, Part 2. Northern stood, absent-minded and absorbed in the moment that seemed to be playing out in slow motion. The woman's face was paler than a couple of moments ago. She tried to reach him from her position with her hands trembling. Not knowing what the heavy ache that overwhelmed his heart was, Northern slowly went down, bending to his knees. He took the woman's hand and helped her to his cheek, his eyes barely holding on as he stared down at her. Several touches could be seen running around the compound of this particular building, but neither of them seemed concerned about it. To Northern, who was seeing the woman that had brought him to this life for the first time, he had thought it wouldn't change a thing to see her. But he was wrong. It changed everything. And the most difficult thing was he didn't even know how to navigate through the emotions. There was pain tightening his chest. He could feel the joy of finally seeing his mother, but at the same time he could also feel a weight of sadness with that joy. Everything was just so unclear, so confusing. A hell of an emotional palette he had never felt before. Something tickled his cheek before he knew it. The moment he felt it, Northern's brow twitched and creased. He wiped the little liquid with his thumb and stared at it blankly. "I'm crying." His, compared to his mother's, was like a drop in the ocean. The lady in front of him was already weeping buckets. Her shoulders trembled as she fondled Northern's cheek with so much care, a sad smile gently beautifying her face. An uneven rhythm of steps resounded in the building as multiple soldiers and servants raced up to check on the treasured lady of the empire. "Maia's son." Her voice trembled as the words came out. Northern frowned. How can she be so sure? There's no iota of doubt in her eyes. He also could see it. Their white hair, although his was quite dirty compared to hers. The blue eyes were just like his. On a few occasions, he had been granted the opportunity to look at his own reflection, and right now it felt like he was looking at himself in the flesh of a woman. There was a striking and indispensable resemblance between the two. That way, it made sense why the Tower Sage recognized him at a glance. It didn't take a genius to figure out he looked so much like Lady Hinai. And almost everyone knew Lady Hinai had lost her child. "Mother!" Northern didn't know how the words dropped. But they did. And immediately they did. The woman drew him close hurriedly and hugged him tight, crying tremendously. At that point, several soldiers broke through the door, all armed with their weapons and ready to wreak hell. But they all paused as they saw what was happening. The lady was hugging someone with white hair. They slowly retreated outside her room, with only one man walking forward through them. Gilliver closed the door behind him. It was slightly broken, but it held. He observed the two of them with a gentle sadness sitting in his eyes. Lady Hinai removed herself from Northern, shaking as she inspected his whole body. "Why? Are you dressed like this? Where have you been? How did you grow up? Where did you live? How are you feeling? What is?" Gilliver's hand slowly touched her shoulder, making her words freeze. He smiled and said to her, "Hinai, why not let him rest first? Let this moment sink. The questions can come later." Lady Hinai looked between the Tower Sage, who was crouching behind her, and Northern, who was kneeling in front of her. Her face contorted with even more sadness. "But I want to know now. I want to know everything about him. I am sure this time around, Gilly, this is my child." "I know, Hinai." His voice resounded with kindness. "I can see it too. He is definitely your son. So, Hinai, trust me, I will take good care of him. You don't want to cause a ruckus at a time like this. Let me take care of him for tonight. You rest, and tomorrow you can come to my place." Northern's face turned grim. Seeing this, Hinai gave a quick response to the Tower Sage. No, I don't want that. I trust you, but my son does not seem to trust you. I don't want to lose him any moment again. I don't want to let him out of my sight again. I was not even given a chance to hold my own child. He was taken out of my hands all for the sake of protecting him. And now you're telling me to do the exact same thing. Hinai, it's not. I appreciate your help, Gilly, but no. The Tower Sage clenched his fist and stood up. "Okay then. Is it okay if I stand guard here through the rest of the night?" Northern tilted his head in curiosity. What the hell is wrong with the man? He went and added when he saw the hesitation in Hinai's after she looked at Northern again. "I will cast a barrier over here. Your conversations will be safe from the outside, even from me." This guy really expects me to believe that? He frowned slightly, but his mother spoke before his expression could be noticed. "That's fine then, Gilly." She responded with the tenderness Northern had noticed earlier. Gilliver bowed his head and backed away. He opened the door. The wooden door creaked painfully as he forced it open. It was a little bit noisy to close it back as it was almost being torn apart completely. But Gilliver tried and eventually closed the door. Immediately the door closed. Silence suddenly overwhelmed everywhere. Northern frowned as he observed the air. It's different, almost like a separate space. Lady Hinai smiled at Northern. What he says he will do is exactly what he will do. Don't worry about it. Northern narrowed his eyes, staring at his mother for a couple of seconds, then looked away for a moment, sheepishly scratching his neck as he said, "You can't trust people so easily like that." The lady's blue eyes flung wide open and almost immediately shrank, unfolding a delightful smile on her face. "It must not have been easy growing up. You are 15 years, 5 months, and 3 days. Northern's eyes were left wide open with surprise. A second later, he said, "Wow!" He was short of words to follow. She touched his jaw once again with a sad smile. "How have you been? How are you on this continent?" Northern looked at her hand and frowned, pulling himself away from her a little bit. The action made Lady Hinai crumble with sadness, her face seeking Northern like a desperate puppy, but she patiently waited for Northern to speak. After a couple of minutes, he looked at her sternly and opened his mouth. "Did you ever look for me?" "I did. Your father promised he would help me, but he never got back to me. There were too many enemies, and he suggested that perhaps it was best for you to stay hidden." Northern looked at her blankly for a couple of seconds, then cautiously asked, "My father? Who is my father?" Her face folded with determination as she spoke. "Your father is the 34th Emperor of the Riemgard Empire, Regal Lion Reshard Riemgard III. Looks like Jesai wasn't wrong after all." He thought and looked at her. "And my name?" She looked at him for a couple of seconds, swallowed, and finally answered with his name. "Rian Artemis Riemgard." She paused and continued, "All your siblings and every other imperial family member have an R for all their names because they are strictly blooded by the imperial family. However," her voice trembled as she came to a pause. Northern frowned, wanting to know more. He said no words, but his expression implored her to continue. She looked down, overwhelmed by shame as she spoke. "Except the bastards. I am of a different lineage. My mother was from a different tribe than the Riemgard and Luengard families. Look at me. I haven't even explained the weird family tree of the two empires to you." "Wait, do you even know?" Northern quickly interrupted her before she could go out of breath. "I know. Just continue, mother." The word she heard warmed her heart more than anything else in the past 15 years of her life. She smiled and went on. "Because you were not of their true origin, you were only allowed to carry one of the Riemgardian names. For your middle name, I decided to name you after the founder of my mother's tribe, which she often told me stories about. Artemis." Northern shrugged a little bit. "Looks like I do have a good name after all." He chuckled for a bit and sat on the ground, looking at the woman. There was a lot on his mind, but hearing his name was a great first step. "I'm a bastard, of some sort." The realization of it didn't seem to hurt at all. Not that he cared to begin with. There was the most important question he really wanted to ask. He looked at his mother with a frown befalling his face and asked, his tone reverberating with power, "Mother, who tried to kill me?" Chapter 426. Complications. Northern sat with his legs crossed, silently waiting for his mother, Lady Hinai, to talk. She also stayed silent. Her face, however, was a mixture of anxiety and uncertainty. Northern decided to fold his hands and be patient with her, deciding to give her time to speak. After a couple of minutes passed, Lady Hinai finally raised her head. She looked passionately into Northern's face and said, "Can't we let it be in the past? You're alive, and that is all that matters. We can start a new life in Luengard. You'll live a peaceful and silent life with your mother, me." Northern's expression folded as he heard her words. This was it. This was one of the complications he had feared. "No," he responded sharply. "I have no intention to stay in Luengard. I had a life before now in the Central Plains, and I plan to go back to that life. When I discovered my mother was a princess in this nation, I just had to see what she looked like for myself. I'm sorry, but I don't expect anything from you." His words were like sharp thorns, deeply shredding her heart. But she understood very well the point he was trying to get to her. Lady Hinai probably wanted to claim her son, the one she had waited over 15 years for. She never wanted anything to separate them again. But she also had to come to terms with the fact that her son was nurtured and cared for by other parents, which, by the looks of how Northern before her eyes had turned out to be such a stern boy at the age of 15, with the tone of a man to his person, have done a great job indeed. But still, she didn't want to let her son go a second time. "You don't need to tell me if you don't want to," Northern said to her. His expression was calm and gentle. "But I need your help." Lady Hinai's face lit up immediately. "I'll do anything for you, my son," she responded with elation. Northern nodded with a soft smile flashing across his face. He lingered for a second and said to her, "I need to go back to the Central Plains. I don't know if you know, but I happen to be one of the students from the academy that was suddenly brought into this desolate continent. I've had to survive through storms and fire for the past 10 months of my life. Now, a window to go back home has appeared." He paused and stared deeply into her eyes. "Mother, please can you help me go back home?" Northern sounded genuine and serious, staring into her eyes unfazed. She lingered after his request, slowly shifted closer to him and said, "Don't you want to spend some time with me? I could introduce you to your uncle. My brother is the Emperor of Luengard Empire. I'm sure his sons, they may not be the best of characters, but I'm sure they'd be glad to have you around." "Would they?" Northern smiled. "Look, I appreciate the hospitality, but I believe there is something much more important that I need to do." His mother's tone rang with surprise. "And what could that be?" "You can talk to me, son." Northern looked at her blankly for a couple of seconds, his mind dividing through some of her words. "Can I trust her? Of course I can trust her. But wouldn't it be dangerous to bring her into all of this?" Raven was planning to flood the entire nation greatly in her desperate plan to escape this desolation. And it looked like all the survivors were with her on this one. Even the ones from Sloria except Zephyr and his subordinates. Graham's location was also unknown. As far as the news went, Afcon was dead. But no one spoke about it. Neither did anyone even confirm it. However, for Northern, the fact that Raven came back alive was enough proof. For a moment, he wondered, how does she even get out alive in a fight with an Ascendant? Or are they not as powerful as the rumors claim? Northern felt Ascendants were supposed to be powerful, incredibly powerful, and the only thing it took to defeat them was an Ascendant. Or maybe 5 sages could pull it off. It was simply impossible for a savant. Which was what brought him to suspect that Raven had a very dangerous trump card that ignored the importance of ranks. Take his Chaos ability, for example. He could even destroy a Paragon if he wanted. Belatedly discovering that he was getting distracted, he brought himself back to the scene and sighed. "I'm sorry, Mother. I just have a lot on my mind." He uncrossed his legs and sat down on the ground, leaning backwards on his hands. He looked at his mother one more time and raised his head up, admiring the architecture work of the ceiling before bringing his head back down to speak. "Mother! Damn, I sound almost weird." Northern's mind shrank from slight cringe, but he continued anyway. "I just need to leave here silently. I know it might not be possible tonight, but I'd like to leave first thing tomorrow morning." Lady Hinai leaned her head closer to him, determination radiating from her beautiful face. "If so, can I follow you?" Northern's mouth fell from her words. "Why? I never want to lose you again. I will never let you out of my sight." Northern observed her for a moment, then leaned away from his hands, placing them gently on her shoulders with care. He smiled and assured her, "You will not lose me again, and I am going to make sure I come back to see you. I promise." She looked at Northern's eyes with a crumbling expression. A smile curled up the corner of her lips, simultaneously causing a tear to drop. "You really do take every one of my physical features. I'm glad it turned out like that." "I'm glad too," Northern smiled. "You are astonishing," he complimented. "Thank you." Silence fell between the two for a few moments before Lady Hinai asked a complicated question. Now that you know you are a prince of Riamgard, do you plan to go there? Chapter 427. Catching up with Mommy. Her question was quite unexpected, and it was another complication. One he had not even given a thought to at all. He was a prince of a powerful empire, one that stood supreme over the largest continent in the world. If not for the absence of sufficient knowledge about the nations in the other two continents, one could as well refer to Riamgard as the strongest nation in the world of Trael. And he was a prince of that place. Who wouldn't want to go back there? He thought about the lavish, princely lifestyle, and if he was to be honest, it was very enticing. Served by maidens, it was the kind of lifestyle he wished he had from childhood. But there were people trying to kill him. There was that too. The moment he returned to the palace, what was the proof that those people were not going to come after him again? Was the imperial family going to accept him? He's a bastard to begin with. That brought him to the realization that even if he wanted to go back there, he needed to be strong first. And he didn't really need to go back there except if being a prince would better propagate his future plans. In other words, and frankly speaking, it was a family he considered a tool. At least for now, but his mother, however, didn't deserve such wickedness, also at least for now. I don't trust anyone, and I won't until I get to the bottom of this matter. But she gave birth to me, so I'm willing to compromise. Northern raised his head straight and looked the woman dead in the eye as he responded. No, not right now, I have no intentions to. His mother lingered, then asked again. What about in the future? Northern's expression remained the same as when he answered before. I don't know. That would depend on the path I choose to take in the future. Am I not merely 15 right now? She smiled and nodded. Indeed you are, but I feel like you have grown far more mature than a 15-year-old should be. Northern giggled a little bit. This hell was not easy on any of us. Each and every one of us had to learn one thing or another, and it contributed to the kind of person we've become now. He thought as he looked down for a moment. Especially me. I have learned a lot. A small frown appeared on his face, and quickly disappeared. Lady Hinai pressed down her lips and looked away for a moment. I'm sorry I wasn't able to help. What would you have done? Northern tilted his head. He smiled a second later. Besides, I'm glad I got to know my real name. There's so much prestige in the name Artemis. I love it. While you were in my womb, your father and I often called you Art. Northern looked at her in a strange way, bringing his head back a little. I'm surprised you and the strongest monarch in the Central Plains had a romantic moment. That was quite ironic to what I was thinking. Lady Hinai covered her lips as she chuckled, commenting afterwards. You wouldn't believe it, but he actually married me because he fell for me. Northern's eyes widened. Then a grin appeared on his face. I mean, with all your beauty, who wouldn't want to marry you? This is nothing. You should really see when I was in my youth. Northern frowned, tilting his head. Oh my days. I thought for a moment that you were still in your youth. I see you gained a skill for flattering women. You must be husband to many. Northern laughed shortly and looked away, folding his hands as he responded. Actually, I am husband to none, and I kind of like it that way. He sounded genuinely proud of himself. She, on the other hand, looked like she just had life sucked out of her. She stared at him for a couple of minutes with a deadpan expression. Then she sighed and said calmly, Art, so is it okay if you stay the night? Tomorrow we can get you to the harbor and you'll leave for the Central Plains. But I'm coming with you, no objections. Northern looked at the woman's eyes. Somehow he could see the resemblance now more than any time. Those were the same eyes he has whenever he was damn sure he wouldn't change a certain decision of his. This woman. He scratched the back of his head and responded, Fine. But I have one question. Lady Hinai breathed. Ask. Isn't there a reason why you left the Central Plains to begin with? If the Emperor was in love with you, why were you giving birth in a forest? And why were people after my life? She let out another gentle but shaky breath. It looked like she was toughening up. She probably wished she wouldn't have to answer the question. Northern even thought she wouldn't, however, she started.
I'm sorry.
My knowledge is very limited and I am not sure who it is in particular. It could be one of your brothers or sisters or it could be their vassals. I don't know. As to the reason why I left, I couldn't take it anymore. Your absence and my presence in that place was torturing me, so I asked him to come home. He didn't want to, but he allowed me in the end. Northern nodded slightly as she gave her answers. When she was done, his words flowed out again. How many brothers and sisters do I have? You have 11 brothers and sisters. You are the last child, which makes you the 12th, particularly 5 girls and 6 boys. Northern's jaw dropped. He was silent for a moment, just staring, stunned. Then afterwards, wow, 11 siblings, that's a lot. How many wives does he have? Lady Hinai smiled. Just one. One woman gave birth to all of them? She nodded. Yes, she's quite a lovely lady. Northern narrowed his eyes. She is? I mean, you stole her husband, sort of. Lady Hinai admitted. It was hard at first, but things got better. How are you sure she's not the one that tried to kill me? Lady Hinai frowned, about to give a stern response when the entire building trembled tremendously. Chapter 428. Infiltration. The entire desert trembled because of one human's furious steps. Jessie moving through the storm was like a storm splitting the red sand in a certain direction. Behind her was a hill of sand and dust that rose like angry waves. She was more than just a running warrior. She looked like a powerful force of nature that no one would dare to go against. Even from afar, the substitute gatemen were already glaring, with their weapons at hand pointed forward in alertness of any strange attack. It looks like a storm coming, one said to his partner. I do hope it stops at that, the other said with a paler expression laying on his face. Suddenly the storm disappeared and everything calmed down. The rising waves of dust from afar slowly settled down. Both of them examined the distance with meticulous caution, before the one that had first spoken said again, Looks like it's gone? Looks like it. The other one's voice came thicker, testifying that he might be older. To them the storm had died down, but Jessie had perfectly executed the cover she needed to escape their sight. The storm cloud was no coincidence. It was meant to be a distraction for them, so they wouldn't even see her coming. It was a bit risky because she stood the chance of being noticed. The Empire gatemen were always trained specially in perception. The fact that she was not perceived informed her that the original gatemen must be dead, which meant Northern was inside the Empire already. She clicked her tongue in frustration, her face wearing out from so much mental stress. How could he do this to me? She thought as she ran forward. This time her steps were light, but she was fast, running steadily but with the legs of wind. Perspiration trickled down all over her face. Even the back of her clothes was damp, but she kept going forward with a light frown on her face. After a while she got to the wall curving outside as usual. She looked up and narrowed her eyes. Then she ran her hand across the wall surface, closing her eyes. She tried to focus more on her sense of touch than any other sense. And soon she felt something. The overall surface of the wall was flawlessly smooth. It was like the skin of a clean cold metal. But there was supposed to be a place which was uneven, slightly bulging out. Jessie opened her eyes the moment she observed it and frowned. She pushed the bulge inwards. Immediately the sand began to leak downward as a door opened on the ground, revealing some dark and decrepit stairs. Jessie made sure she looked back, and confirmed that there was no one there before jumping into the underground stairs. As she descended the stairs, the entry point automatically closed. As the bulge slowly pushed back forward, sand moved to cover the surface of the opened ground, as if being carried by an invisible force. After a while, not even the most brilliant of detectives would suspect that there was something like an entry point in this place. About an hour later, a couple of persons stood at the edge of the desert. They were Raven, who compared to other times was clean, her face neatly shimmering in the dim night. Her crimson eyes, however, were vicious and void of emotion. Equipped in black, lithe armor, with a black cloak like darkness fluttering over her body. Helena, who wore a green light attire, what covered her body was just a tight-fitted short that stopped just above her knee. Her upper attire resembled a kimono in the sense that it also had a collar that crossed over each other. Her toned muscles were on display. Her eyes were tentatively staring forward. There was Ryan John, who was the razor-teeth, short guy with spiky blue hair. And the last person was Erickson, whom by all look and form was timidity in person. He even seemed to be more timid than Ellis and also socially awkward. One would never see a guy like him around the crowd. In fact, he was rarely seen at all. Raven had insisted that he become a party leader at the time. And even though everyone at the end agreed to it, they still believe he's pretty useless. And right now, Raven had insisted that Erickson come with them. Everyone does not understand why she would ask for such. Even Erickson himself does not understand. But she still insisted. They all lined the edge of the point where the red desert that led to the Empire Wall started. It's indeed a beautiful place. Enormous, Helena exclaimed. Raven glanced at her with a look of disapproval. What? Helena groaned. You clearly have not actually been to the academy, if you think this is amazing. Indeed, the walls of Luengard Empire are magnificent, but the academy. Her words got caught in her throat as she tried to speak. Then John continued for her. It's enormous. He looked at her with a small frown leaving his face. Raven gave a complimentary smile and focused her gaze forward, towards the curving wall lining the horizon. Helena shrugged and spoke after a couple of seconds of silence. So, are we going to stand here and watch all night? Raven creased her brows. Of course not. Her eyes turned to her left and right, observing everyone beside her. Then she faced forward and said, We need some sort of distraction. Helena, your talent involves something around the atmosphere you find yourself in, right? Do you think you can do it? Helena's brows came together. How the hell did she know that? Her thoughts trailed off. She stepped forward either way and crouched, touching the sand with both of her hands. Her eyes started to emit an amber glow. The markings on her face immediately grew, crossing over themselves on her face. From each side of her jaw, over her eyes to her forehead. She closed her eyes and opened them. Immediately the sand began to rise like waves and began to surge forward powerfully. John's eyes widened. Oh, bless my mother. What did you do? Helena looked at her hand. Well, to be particular, I can change the properties of my surroundings, but certain conditions have to be met. She looked at the mighty desert wave of sand surging forward like a tsunami and added, What I did was give the desert the property of water and made it quite chaotic. That's impressive, John complimented. She is impressive, Raven agreed. We have to go now. In that moment, all their gazes became obstinate. Chapter 429. The Mighty Flood, Part 1. All 5 of them, with the cover of the storm, made way behind Raven. After a long few minutes, they arrived at a side of the wall. By this time, the tsunami of sand had crashed against the gate of the wall. Of course, it left no tangible effect. The gatemen, however, were just covered in sand. Raven repeated what Jesai had done, and after a moment, the entry point on the ground began to open. Raven watched with patience. Everything was unfolding the same way it had unfolded in her familiar's memory fed to her. After losing one of them, this was the last one, and she was really skeptical about letting it go. These familiars were the closest thing Raven had to family. Because from childhood, a pair is given to every member of the family regardless of who they are. Of course, these familiars have even stronger types. Raven frowned and cautiously led them into the bunker. They climbed down and soon started climbing back up. However, the way up was sealed. Since Raven's familiar didn't follow her inside because she wanted to be careful, Raven didn't know exactly how she was going to open the door. However, she didn't need to. She looked at the others in the darkness and made a speech. This is the juncture, she said to them. We are probably not going to be able to live with this decision, wrecking the livelihood of thousands of people because we want to go home. But we have no choice. I see no other way out of this place. I'm sorry if I am cruel. She bowed her head sincerely as she apologized. The others groaned in silence. John looked at her, a frown etched upon his face. He dismissed the frown and inquired, So, what do we do now? Raven brought out the small bottle. The water in this bottle and the force is powerful enough to shatter a person into smithereens. So, I'll need everyone to back out while I open it. Ryan, who had been around like he hadn't been around, suddenly grimaced at Raven. What are you thinking of doing, Lady Raven? If this thing is strong enough to shatter a person into smithereens, why should you be the one to stay with it? Raven turned her eyes to him, deadpanned. Who else will do it if I don't? Ryan slapped his chest, his eyes brimming with confidence. I can. I'm sure I can cover myself with ice cones that would protect me from the force. Raven shook her head. The force generated will destroy this place in an instant. It will break into the entire city from the ground. The force is probably strong enough to even knock down their gate or at least leave it in a very wounded state. Ryan, I thank you for your concern, but you can't do this. Your ice power is not enough. Then what about you? The boy yelled. You are going to kill yourself with this. Raven smiled and cocked her head. Yes, it will be painful, but don't worry, Ryan. I will not die. Her words were genuine and soothing. Ryan heard them and his anger immediately dissipated. Raven was one of the first few people he made friends with. She was the one that made him a less socially awkward person. Before, all he used to do was hide in a hole or anywhere dark. He would step out in the night to find something to eat while hiding away in the day, until one faithful night he met Raven. That night marked the beginning of their friendship, with Raven being endlessly persistent until he came out of his shell. So to him, he owed her everything, including his loyalty. The only reason why he joined Annette's faction was because he knew Raven had it in for Gilbert and he had a grudge against Sloria for what they did to her. It was incredibly hard for him to let her go, but her smile just now made it all easy. He clenched his hands and stepped back on the stairs. The others also looked at Raven and nodded in understanding. Helena looked at Raven with pity wafting across her face. She seemed to know something the others did not and was not going to say anything. Take care of yourself, she said to Raven, and was the first one to turn away. After she turned away, the others gave Raven a glance and also began to walk away, until Ryan was left. Raven gave him a long gaze and said, You should go now too, Ryan. He clenched his teeth and turned away. You better not die, he said and walked away, climbing the stairs out of the bunker. Raven stared at their silhouettes till they were no more and murmured, I can't escape death, but at least I won't stay dead. She placed the bottle gently on the step above her. She gently pulled out the cover blocking it and stepped back quickly, allowing herself to fall down the stairs. The bottle began to tremble slightly at first, then soon heavily. What followed was a powerful explosion that did not only shatter the bunker, but destroyed even the ground within 100 meters. It was like an explosive bomb was planted underground, causing the entire surface to overturn. All around, tremors began to run across the ground like mad dogs. Everywhere began to tremble. Vibrations began to shake the colossal wall. And suddenly, everyone could tell that something was not all right. From a part of the wall, an enormous spring of water suddenly burst forth into the air, blasting forward into houses and carrying any and everything on its path. Chaos erupted in the city as the flood tore through the streets. Water surged with a ferocious speed, turning alleys into rivers and plazas into raging whirlpools. The sheer force uprooted trees, smashed through windows, and sent debris flying in all directions. Screams filled the air as people scrambled for higher ground, desperately trying to escape the relentless surge. The flood moved with a terrifying momentum, a living beast devouring everything in its path. In moments, the once bustling market square was submerged. Stalls, carts, and goods were swept away, their remnants swirling in the churning waters. The floodwaters carried away livestock, wagons, and even the heavy stone statues that once stood proudly as the city's sentinels. Everything, before anyone could respond to the danger, was submerged in an overwhelming amount of water. Chapter 430. The Mighty Flood, Part 2. On the far side of the city, the massive stone wall that barricaded the seaport groaned under the pressure. The ancient structure, long considered impenetrable, began to crack as the floodwater pushed against it with an unyielding force. As the cracks spread, the wall buckled and, with a thunderous crash, gave way, unleashing another wave of destruction. The crash of the stone wall reverberated like a colossal hammer striking the earth, sending tremors far and wide. For a moment, there was silence. an eerie stillness that lingered before the chaos. Then, with a deafening roar, the floodwaters surged forward, freed from their ancient confines. The water, dark and swollen with debris, moved with terrifying speed. It slammed into the first row of houses near the seaport, wooden structures splintering instantly under the sheer force. The buildings crumbled like matchsticks, their foundations ripped from the earth as the flood swept them away. On another side of the city, the floodwater surged further into the narrow streets, channeling its ferocity, turning alleys into deadly torrents. Stones that had paved the roads for centuries were torn free and carried along, becoming deadly projectiles that added to the destruction. Windows shattered from the mere force of the flood, walls buckled, and roofs caved in, all drowned in the relentless tide. The panic was instantaneous. People, caught unaware by the sudden invasion of the flood, scrambled to find higher ground or any kind of shelter. Mothers clutched their children tightly, their faces twisted with terror as they ran, desperately searching for safety amidst the chaos. Some fathers tried to shield their families with their own bodies, only to be swept away by the relentless torrent, their last cries drowned by the raging waters. The flood did not discriminate. It claimed everyone in its path. The elderly, too frail to run, were quickly overtaken, their feeble attempts to find refuge ending in futility. Children screamed for their parents, only to be torn away by the sheer force of the flood. Entire families were separated in an instant, with no chance of reunion in the maelstrom that followed. Simultaneously, as the flood terrorized the city flowing towards the palace, it terrorized the port. Ships docked in the harbor, some moored and others floating free, were almost no match for the waves' might. Smaller vessels capsized almost immediately, their crews thrown into the turbulent waters. Some medium-sized ships were torn from their anchors and flung against the piers. While the larger ones could withstand the force of the crowd, however, waters rushed into them, carrying people and smashing them against things. The crashing of timber and metal rang out as ships were dashed to pieces, their remains strewn across the water like toys abandoned by a careless child. The harbor itself, a proud symbol of Lewingard Empire's wealth and power, was soon swallowed by the flood. Warehouses filled with goods from across the seas were inundated, their contents, spices, silks, weapons, swept into the streets and scattered like so much flotsam. The docks, once bustling with activity, were now a wasteland of wreckage, the few survivors clinging to whatever they could find as they were carried along by the current. As the waters continued to rise, those who had sought refuge in the tallest buildings watched in horror as their last hopes for safety were drowned beneath the relentless tide. Many clung to whatever they could, rooftops, treetops, even floating debris, hoping against hope that they might somehow survive the onslaught. But the flood was merciless. The torrent tore people from their grips, dragged them under, and carried them away into the dark, churning sea it had formed in their city. In the distance, the Empire's colossal wall, a marvel of engineering that had stood as a sentinel against the outside world for centuries, began to tremble. The flood, having carved its way through the city, now pressed against the wall with all its might. The wall was more than just a barrier. It was a symbol of the Empire's invincibility, a reminder to all who saw it that nothing could breach its defenses. But now, under the relentless assault of the flood, that invincibility was being tested. The water pounded against the wall, its force magnified by a strange pressure and force. It was as if this flood has a might of its own that transcended common sense. Cracks, barely visible at first, began to appear along the base of the wall, spreading upward like veins of a diseased tree. The smooth stone, once thought unbreakable, began to crumble as the cracks widened, chunks of masonry tumbling into the flood below. With each passing moment, the pressure increased. The floodwaters, unable to find an easy escape, began to climb, rising up the wall and spilling over its edge. The once dry sands on the other side of the wall were now drenched, the water pouring in like a waterfall from the heavens. Inside the city, panic had reached a fever pitch. People who had taken refuge in what they thought were safe places now found themselves trapped as the water surged higher and higher. Some sought shelter in the upper floors of buildings, but even there, the flood pursued them, rising with a terrifying inevitability. The Empire's knights, once proud and disciplined, had all rushed out to grant refuge and save the city somehow, but in matter of minutes, they were now scattered and disorganized. Those stationed around wall and by the gate had the most terrifying experiences. The water threw itself against them and smashed them against the wall and gate with terrifying viciousness and anger. Others shouted orders, trying to maintain control, but it was clear to all that the wall would not hold for long. The first breach came with a shuddering crack that echoed across the city. A section of the wall, weakened by the relentless pressure, gave way, and water poured through the gap with the fury of a tidal wave. The breach widened rapidly, the stones crumbling as the water forced its way through, and soon the wall began to collapse in earnest. Massive stones, some as large as a man, tumbled from their place, crashing down into the city below. Some tall and sturdy buildings that had managed to withstand the flood were flattened in an instant, crushed under the weight of the falling debris. The floodwaters, now unhindered, surged through the gap, tearing out of the city like a vengeful beast unleashed from its chains. One would think the water levels were supposed to go down, but no, it continued to rise, becoming even more ferocious. One side as the wall continued to collapse, and sections of the city were consumed. The noble district, which was closer to the imperial palace, began to face the same amount of terror. It was as if the water's ego was boasted after destroying the wall. However, the nobles' district was not just another part of the empire. It was home to the empire's most powerful families. Several drifters began to fly outside, stretching forth their hands and ejecting a barrier to put a stop to the raging water, all screaming in intense fear. Where did the flood suddenly come from? How is this possible? Eldex, save our heads. Protect the palace. The barriers held for a while, but it couldn't hold for long. Each person with their own barrier-kind power could feel it. They could feel the overwhelming force of the flood, how it intends to destroy everything in its path. The barriers shimmered in the twilight, arcs of light pulsating from the outstretched hands of the drifters, as they fought against the relentless force of the flood. The sheer power of the water seemed almost supernatural, as though it was driven by a malevolent will, intent on breaking through every defense the nobles could muster. The noble district, once a sanctuary of luxury and privilege, was now a battlefield against nature's wrath. The grand manors with their ornate facades and carefully tended gardens were now besieged, their foundations trembling as the floodwaters battered against them with unyielding ferocity. "Hold the line!" One of the drifters, a high-ranking noble with a crest of silver wings on his chest, shouted above the roar of the flood. His face was etched with determination, but there was a flicker of desperation in his eyes as he poured more soul essence into the barrier he erected, reinforcing it with every ounce of strength he had. But the water was relentless. It surged forward with a roar, slamming against the barriers with a force that sent shockwaves through the air. Cracks began to appear in the shimmering walls of light, spider webbing out from the points of impact. The drifters gritted their teeth, their arms shaking as they struggled to maintain the barriers. Inside the houses, families huddled together, their faces pale with fear. Children clung to their parents, their small bodies trembling as they listened to the thunderous crash of water against stone. The noble women, usually so composed and graceful, were now frantic, their eyes darting toward the windows where the flood raged just beyond the thin veil of the barriers. From the rooftop of a certain building in the palace, a white-haired boy watched with a dark frown as this disaster unfurled, fully terrorizing the entire nation. He muttered with anger, "Damned raven." Chapter 431. The Interceptor. Northern stood and watched the disaster from the top of his mother's chamber, his expression carrying a mood of intense anger. He expected that she was going to do this, but that was before things had progressed to this level. Besides, standing here and watching as people perished with screams and cries in the flood made everything seem wrong. All that the young girl had done was nothing short of devilish, carnal, and evil. These people didn't deserve so much cruelty. He boiled with searing hot anger as he watched. Probably if the people were watching this, they'd also feel so much hate for themselves. It was understandable that they would do anything to go back home, but a disaster of this level is morally unfair and unacceptable by common sense. Northern washed down his face with his hand. Currently, the palace was trying to evacuate as many people as they could into the main palace building. Northern had no idea why the main building, which sat like a pyramid, was their choice, but he guessed that these people had some kind of plan in motion. After all, the evacuation was being handled by the Tower Sage himself. However, he hadn't heard anything from the Emperor. Jesai had said that he was in solitary training. Perhaps he won't come out. Northern thought subtly as he scanned the surroundings with a calm gaze. Afar, the nobles and soldiers were still fighting to hold the water, but it was only a matter of time before their barriers came crashing down. Northern sighed. Looks like I have no choice. He was about to leap off the roof when he looked down. Someone was running towards him. He narrowed his eyes. Jesai! She maneuvered her way to the top of the building, jumping almost like a monkey, even with a spear in one of her hands. She landed on the slanted rooftop and bowed to Northern before standing up and glaring into his eyes. Why did you have to do that? Northern smiled a little, hoping to surpass her anger with his pretty smile. And then he said, I'm sorry, Jesai. I just wanted to see my mother, I guess. Jesai glared more, but with such honest words from Northern, she couldn't stay angry for long. She let out an exasperated sigh and turned in the direction of the flood, her face folding with heavy concern. What in the world is suddenly happening? A realization suddenly struck Northern, causing his brows to crease. Jesai, did Raven see you leave? Jesai had a puzzled expression on her face due to the question. She lingered curiously before answering Northern. The black-haired girl with red devilish eyes? Yes, she did. Northern's frown became more grim. He bowed his head and clenched his fist tightly, his tone groaning with an intense mixture of pain and anger as he mumbled her name strongly. Jesai could feel the air become hot and heavy. She instinctively took some subtle steps backward because she didn't want to suffocate under the air. Northern breathed out, calming himself. His expression became deadpan as he said to her, Make sure you are safe, Jesai. I'll go and put an end to this. Without waiting for her response, Northern flew off the building, softly landing on top of the next and continued to jump from building to building until he got to one of the buildings that stood high around where the nobles had gathered, fighting the flood. Northern observed the wall of flood with narrowed eyes, wondering, it's so massive and powerful. How is an item like that even existent? It was impossible to think that such a tiny and small item held such destructive force of water. How did it even make any sense? Northern shook his head either way and looked at the fighting sea fiercely, chaos eyes revealing themselves. The moment he could see with chaos eyes, his spatial awareness spread all over the entire empire. In that shocking moment, Northern felt an overwhelming pressure and fear at a particular point. He quickly retrieved his awareness from the place and folded back, almost stumbling. Felt like he had looked into something he wasn't supposed to look into. What in the world was that? Having no idea left him completely open and utterly uncomfortable. But he had better things to do right now than cower in fear of the unknown. Northern stood up, closed his eyes, held his hands out into the air, and spread them. Who is that crazy dude? Someone from below muttered as they saw what Northern was doing. Are you even seriously focusing on that right now? We are going to lose our families if we don't finish evacuating before Father and the rest of the nobles and knights crumble under the power of the flood. And you're here looking at someone. Dude, just run along. You just wasted more time talking than I did. The other responded and ran into the next building. Unseen by anyone, pitch-black whirlpools began to appear in the depths of the water. And from the depth of the water, a strong force began to suck in the flood. At once, the nobles noticed the reduction in the force of the water and quickly looked at each other. When they all came out to fight, their intention was only to hold long enough until most of their families had been evacuated. Looks like the stellar array has not abandoned us, they said one to another and began to push back with the barrier. The realization that they just might survive fueled their muscles with strength and their souls with essence. Northern watched as they all fought back with amazing strength. A second later, he moved his gaze to the water that was slowly beginning to reduce, pouring into the limitless void. He had opened up a path to the mountains in the limitless void and created several gateways, but instead of creating them as normal rifts in space, he used his small authority over the void to formulate a pulling force. The nature of the water's depth also made it easy, along with his familiarity with ligatures and chaos constructs. All in all, everything he had learned by experience came to play out usefully in saving the Luingard Empire. Northern smiled, pleased as the water began to reduce considerably. Suddenly, he swung his face to the side. Before he could register anything coming, he was struck. Northern felt all the muscles in his body tear apart, but they were forcibly held together by the void in him and chaos thread. He helplessly flew away from the hammer-like attack without even seeing his attacker yet. Chapter 432. The Stranger, Part 1. In the bunker where the flood had originated from lay a dismantled body. What could be made out of this body was mere chunks of flesh, spread blood, and ripped clothes. Suddenly, the crimson pool of blood began to transition slowly, first becoming colorless like water, then slowly gaining a white ambience to its nature. In a matter of seconds, it was like a pool of snow, managing to keep its form despite being liquefied. The pool of blood from a couple of minutes ago became a white sheet across the dark ground, softly sparkling. Soon, this white sheet began to pull together. The movement was subtle but definitely visible. Slowly, the chunks of flesh scattered across the ground were being drawn closer by the white liquid. It was as if light had been given a liquid form and was now acting as a magnetic pull of some sort. A couple of seconds passed, and the chunks of flesh were closer than ever. Miraculously, every torn-out chunk of flesh fit together like pieces of a puzzle. After a while, a naked feminine body was formed on the ground. There were several marks like a map where the chunks of flesh had puzzled into each other. Those marks were traced by a shimmering white light, and soon everything began to heal. The marks disappeared, the scars. Everything went away like it was never there. Throughout the whole process, Raven's eyes were wide open. Not once did her consciousness dwindle. From the moment she was blasted into bits by the force of the flood until now, when she was whole once again, she had been very much alive and conscious. Thus, she had lived with the excruciating pain of her body being separated and had to endure an even more hellish experience of it piecing itself back together. Such a tremendous and horrific feeling of pain was more than enough to break a mortal's mind and turn them into nothing but crazed individuals. However, as Raven stood up, her armor weaving into existence around her body, her eyes brimmed with unbridled determination. Her eyes looked just as fierce as they did a couple of minutes ago before she died. Well, technically, she did not die. Her body could not withstand the damage. However, essentially speaking, Raven was an immortal being. She carries scars of death more than anyone could ever imagine. She shrugged off the pain like it was nothing and slowly walked out of the bunker. The moment she reached the surface level, however, her face contorted with confusion. The water level had dropped below her knee and was still rapidly dropping. She knitted a frown on her forehead as she walked forward, examining with keen curiosity what exactly had gone wrong. After a couple of minutes of examination, she still couldn't find the reason why the flood had suddenly retreated. But the damage had been done. The path to the harbor was straight in front of her, free of any buildings or obstacles. Behind her, a large part of the wall had collapsed due to the force of the ocean, and she could see them from afar, marching toward the Empire with blazing fury. A small smile played on her lips as she turned swiftly and began to march gallantly toward the wrecked harbor. Meanwhile, the Tower Sage, the princes, and some prestigious knight commanders had managed to round everyone up to the Central Imperium. They were all scattered in the large hall, mainly the important and high-ranking officials who had happened to be at the palace overnight. There were special guests, such as merchants and nobles from other countries. As gruesome as the disaster was, Luingard Empire operated like every other country, no less so, gathering prestige, tributes, and international relationships. In a corner of the hall, beside the window, Lady Hinai stood, worried about her son, who had somehow gotten lost in the crowd. But Gilliver had promised to bring her son back, so she was patiently waiting while everyone else freaked out. Suddenly, she saw a red streak fly super fast across the sky. She immediately gasped, "Brother!" Simultaneously, the two princes, one with ashen white hair and the other slightly whiter than the former, both grimaced and muttered at the same time. "Father is out of solitary training. I can feel his energy too. It's even more powerful than before he left." Gulliver was leading the princes to the noble district where the water was barricaded when, all of a sudden, the water started reducing. Then the emperor suddenly streaked across the sky, viciously impaling someone above the roof with a ground-shattering blow. They watched as the individual flew across the air, crashing in and out of several distinguished buildings, before eventually not crashing out of a certain one. "But who is he?" the prince with whiter hair, Prince Andrei, asked. His voice was like it was cut out of a thin screech. "I have no idea, but if father came out, then it's not good," the older Prince Razakar said. Meanwhile, Gilliver stayed silent, thinking to himself, "I felt a tremendous aura just now. Something dark, vicious, and incredibly powerful. I'm sure the Emperor felt it too and was incredibly threatened by its existence, which is why he went for it straight away." He pressed his lips together. "I should find Lady Hinai's son before this gets any messier." He turned to the princes and announced to them, "I'm sorry, sires, but I need to find someone." Prince Razakar frowned. "Someone? Who?" The tower sage bowed his head without responding and hastily left their presence. Prince Andrei gnarled at him as he briskly walked away and soon leaped. "I can't stand that guy at all. The only thing that has kept him alive so far is Lady Hinai and father. Look at you with the talk. Are you sure you can take him down? He might only be a sage, but he has millennia of knowledge at his disposal. That by far outbalances the power scale between the two of you." He frowned darkly at the sky. "Right now, let's find out who in the dark stars that person is." Chapter 433. The Stranger, Part 2. On the roof of one of the prestigious buildings lined in a linear array, stood a man. His presence caused a sudden stillness in the atmosphere. There was not a single noble below who did not know him. He stood bare-chested, unbothered by the arrogant winds that swept through the air in the aftermath of the powerful flood. His muscular form seemed carved from a relentless pursuit of strength. His torso was a tapestry of scars, each one a testament to battles fought and won, a story told in flesh rather than words. The hard lines of his abdomen, the powerful curve of his shoulders, and the unyielding strength in his arms all spoke of a life forged in discipline and hardship. His hair, white and resembling the sky on a bright day, was tousled by the wind, framing a face marked by intensity. Dark, sharp eyes held a gaze that could pierce through the toughest of opponents. Yet they were deep, shadowed by experiences that would have broken a lesser man. His expression was one of quiet determination, the kind that is earned through countless trials and battles that tested not just his body, but his very soul. The black cloth wrapped around his waist and legs contrasted sharply with the stark whiteness of his hair, flowing with the wind as if it had a life of its own. The fabric was bound tightly, ensuring it would not hinder his movement, while the rest of the garment allowed for fluidity and speed. It was the attire of a fighter who needed no armor, one whose defense was as much in his mind as in his reflexes. His hands were wrapped in dark, taped gloves that extended past his wrists, the material thick enough to protect yet flexible enough to allow the full range of motion required by a skilled warrior. There was a cold, dangerous aura about his presence that made all the nobles freeze in fear. They didn't even need to see the person on the rooftop to know who was standing there. Rather, they were concerned about the person who had flown away. The emperor narrowed his eyes, assured that the person he had just struck was dead. He then turned his gaze to the rest of the city. The city lay in ruins, a grim testament to the power of nature that had just been unleashed in its most destructive form. The floodwaters, once a relentless torrent that devoured everything in their path, had finally receded, leaving behind a landscape unrecognizable from what it had been just a couple of hours before, to the emperor, days. Buildings that once stood tall, proud symbols of their achievement, were now skeletal remnants of their former selves. Their foundations, once thought unshakable, had been undermined by the furious waters, leaving them cracked and crumbling, some reduced to nothing more than heaps of rubble. The streets, which had thrived with the hum of daily life, were now buried under layers of thick, muddy silt. Debris, both familiar and foreign, was strewn everywhere. Fragments of shattered windows, twisted metal, and the waterlogged remains of personal belongings, all mingling in a chaotic tapestry of loss. The Emperor's dark face grew even darker as all the scenery sank into his mind. The reality settled in that while he was in solitary training to surpass the limit of a paragon, his nation had been destroyed. From where he was standing, he could see everything as if it was in the palm of his hand. He could see the crowd viciously advancing toward his broken nation. He could see the strange lady emanating a vicious light walking towards the harbor. All of it was infuriating, but the Emperor still managed to maintain a cool, calm front. All the nobles' eyes were on him with looks that said, "The Emperor is here. Finally, all is settled." Their eyes shone with so much trust and respect in his presence. However, his calm and cool demeanor was not due to their trust in him. Rather, it was his trust in his own abilities. To put it simply, he was quite sure that in this entire continent, there was not a single person stronger than him. However, there was a slight disturbance, but it didn't matter since he had eliminated it immediately. Which is why he just needed to. He froze and sharply turned his head in the direction he had thrashed the strange boy toward. However, from the opposite direction, some black, unstable darkness pierced through like lightning. Without looking, the Emperor caught it with one hand. Then he slowly turned his head to the creature. Night Terror most times had an expression of blankness. It was difficult to read what was on the monster's expression, except for some exclusively spectacular moments when he was enjoying the fight. But right now, he did not have the look of enjoyment on his face. It was one of pure terror. Yes, for the first time, even the great Night Terror felt terror course through his dark veins. Immediately, he severed his hand forcefully, leaving his forearm in the man's grip, and jumped as far back as he could. From behind, someone began to shimmer into existence. The person had white, flowing hair and was taller than a normal human. He had a blank expression on his face. His body was so pale it was almost white. His eyes had a golden iris that focused solely on the Emperor. The Emperor frowned slightly. The creature had a very disturbing presence, but there was something that left him confused. "You are definitely not him, but why do I feel the same ominous energy from you?" the Emperor said, looking at the white-haired being that was clearly not human. The being was silent, not saying anything. The Emperor tilted his head slightly and glared. His eyes brimmed with cruelty, and in the next second he was gone. No, the next second was too far-fetched. It was as though the next second was when he reached the man, with a blasting torrent of wind accompanying his bare feet. He crushed the being's neck with a tight clench of his hand before the being could do anything. Simultaneously, Northern sat languidly on the throne of the Void Palace, utterly shocked as Khal's soul was vanquished before the being could take action. Honestly, he had thought that Khal was his strongest piece. At least Night Terror knew to save himself. No, let's not think about it like that. What if he had intentionally dealt with Khal with more intensity than he did with Night Terror? All he did was block Night Terror's attack. He could even see the attack coming without having to look. Northern held his head in deep thought. How exactly do I get out of this? No doubt about it. He's a paragon. He must be the Emperor. Northern looked down at his side. It was literally empty. All his organs on that side of his body had been completely obliterated. However, it was now filled with inky darkness that breathed like it was alive. While Chaos Thread was busy weaving his organs from the very beginning, usually it should not work that way. Because once his organs had been obliterated, he was supposed to be on the verge of death or very much dead already. But Northern found himself being kept alive by the insane amount of void in him. He even felt so numb he couldn't feel anything. However, There was a stinging pain as the chaos thread knitted through the smithereens of his organs. Which is why he couldn't afford to go back to the surface world right now. Immediately he landed. He sank himself into the limitless void, totally erasing his presence from the surface world. And like an eminence of darkness, he sent soul summons to fight his battle for him in the surface world while he recovered. At the same time, he hated the fact that he had to sit here and wait without being able to do anything. He had to heal, he knew, but knowing did not make the feeling of helplessness any better. This guy was obliterating his summons before they even tried. He looked up tiredly and summoned Pangu. A darkness wriggled in front of him, forming the silhouette of a man who bowed on one knee in front of the dancing black flames. Northern breathed painfully as the agonizing weave of the chaos thread continued. You were the one with Kal's soul before, right? I will give it to you now and permanently merge it with you with the power of the void. You will lose yourself and you won't be Kal either. Do you want to do it? The darkness seemed silent for a second. Northern had taken the effort to ask for his opinion in particular because he and a couple of others were specifically created by the Chaos Prince. What he was about to do would completely change all of that. He was about to undo the entire makings of the Chaos Prince. Chapter 434. The Constructs. Northern was not sure how the Chaos Prince was able to create animate beings, but he had a guess. He could see chaos constructs, which the Chaos Prince himself must have been able to comprehend at a transcendental level, of course. Before, Northern thought that the Chaos Prince couldn't see or affect ligatures and their chaos constructs. He thought he was the first of his kind. However, after what he saw in the tower and meeting these animate beings created by the Chaos Prince, he began to reason otherwise. When the void became a larger part of him than chaos, and he gained the memory and understanding of the void, not all, however, Northern now understood that there was more to the Chaos Prince than met the eye. Now, Northern considered that the Chaos Prince himself could actually create chaos constructs. However, he also felt that the idea was too wild and overpowered. While he wasn't dismissing its possibility, he also wanted to form theories based on facts that are, for now, more believable. Thus, he settled on the thought that the Chaos Prince could manipulate chaos constructs, just like he could. No. What Northern could do was not befitting to be called manipulation when compared to what the Chaos Prince could do. At least, not when considering what he had done with Pangu and the rest of the formless summons. But now that Northern was synchronized with the void, he felt like he could do the same thing. Although not from scratch, and it was going to take extreme, meticulous handling. Plus, he was sure his stamina would be drained significantly. Hell, he didn't even know if he'd be able to fight at all should he go down that route. Because while the void didn't seem to be asking for anything in return for granting him such an overpowered ability, which he had yet to fully explore, it was insanely eating away at his stamina, now more than ever. Northern could barely even lift a leg. He sat there looking as if he was paralyzed. I guess I just have to try. Northern mused and sighed. Northern had never known about the existence of void constructs. Yes, just like chaos constructs, there was also something known as void constructs, and both were the muscle fibers that make up a ligature. However, since chaos constructs played a more active role than void constructs did. Void constructs were the foundation of a ligature. They were what kept them anchored. To put it another way, void constructs were essentially the foundation of reality, space. Chaos constructs, however, were more of an active part of existence within the ligatures, time and its sequence of events. But Northern was not ready to dive deep into that part of their usefulness. What he wanted to do was simple. Although the Chaos Prince created these animate beings using chaos as a major part of their existence, they still had that void within them. Their shapelessness and shadowy form were more than enough to indicate that. What Northern wanted to do now was switch sides, place chaos in the recessive part and void in the dominant part. Doing this would leave the animate being empty and numb, which was exactly what Northern needed. When it was empty and numb, he would then instill a soul, thus permanently creating something different. Whatever would be born would be a mixture of both but would have its own traits. Northern first thought of doing this with Night Terror, but the thought of losing Night Terror terrified him. So he decided that he was going to use Kal. Northern signaled for Pangu to come forward. The silhouette slowly passed through the flames without being affected and stopped at Northern's feet, lowering itself. Northern closed his eyes and slowly opened them, revealing Chaos eyes. Then he began to exchange the lines of flames that intertwined with each other, softly ringing but definitely giving essence and existence to Pangu. Northern had to strain because he had to endure the pain of the sewing ongoing in his belly, while also trying to untangle multiple weaves, turning one for the other. As he did, subtle changes could be noticed in the silhouette's form, such as gaining a luster and shiny surface, just like Night Terror's carapace. And when Northern was done, the animate being stood still. Even though its body had gained a luster, it was still formless, droopy like a slimy liquid, and struggling to keep a shape. He then summoned Call, who, despite having been killed just now, was still fine. Of course, he was essentially a clone. Northern had just made him inhabit his clone, but now he was about to make it something else. He breathed calmly, and with the authority of the void within him, ordered Call to merge with the animate being. Call's soul, without the slightest disobedience or delay, transformed into a black ball of light and flew into the animate matter. Immediately, the form began to straighten up. Northern frowned as he saw this happen. The fact was, he himself was not sure if this was going to work. He just took a wild guess and tried to be innovative with the things he had gained from the memory of the void. If it failed, he would be losing a very strong soul, another reason why using Night Terror was not even an option. But if it was successful, let's hope it is first. He tried to calm himself from all the excitement. The form began to become more solid, forming the lithe frame of a man. It was pitch black, with white lines running across its body like circuits, converging to form a circle in the middle of its torso. Sharp eagle-like eyes with blue slit pupils opened to life. A small pointed nose formed, and a white line split open the mouth of the being, with flawless white teeth forming out of nothing within them. Northern watched in amazement as the being manifested before him. It was not as tall as Call initially was, but it was taller than Northern, perhaps standing at a height of 6 feet 9 inches. His muscles were toned and coiled like a couple of black snakes bound together along his arms and back. As Northern's mouth fell open in awe, he muttered, "Oh crap! It was successful." Chapter 435. Black Mamba, Part 1. Northern stared blankly at the creature he had just created. Even though he didn't do it all from the start, this being existed because of his own actions. It was neither Call nor Pangu. Northern narrowed his eyes. He tried to bring himself closer to look but couldn't. He was forced to sit back down as the pain intensified with each strain. But at the very least, his condition was already getting better. One side of his body had completely closed like a hole was not just there. He still managed to frown and intensely examine the creature standing before him. Its body was a perfect fusion of strength and grace, with muscles defined and taut, yet entirely devoid of any human skin. Instead, its surface was obsidian black, a shade so deep that it seemed to swallow the subtle blue light of the flames around it. The texture was like metal, hard and unyielding, but with the unsettling appearance of something more organic, flesh-like, but not flesh. Running across its nightmarish form were thin, white lines, tracing intricate patterns like circuits on a machine. These lines pulsed rhythmically, converging in the center of its torso, forming a perfectly symmetrical circle that hummed with an almost palpable energy. The being's head was devoid of hair, smooth and sleek, accentuating the sharp angles of its face. The creature was menacing from every angle. The sad thing about this creature was that the system was not showing anything. Northern had expected some sort of announcement or something that would help him navigate what this being could do, its abilities, and other information he needed to register. But there was absolutely nothing. However, at the same time, Northern felt a vivid sense of connection to this being. And it was stronger than the link between him and his clones. Right now, he didn't know what this creature could do, but he felt like he could know if he wanted to. A subtle feeling like, if I dig deeper into my memory, I should remember, kind of feeling, which was why he decided not to stress it and instead, "Let's see how well you can do," he said. "Let's see how well you can do." Northern's eyes widened. What the hell? Did it just speak? It said the exact same thing that he had said. However, its speech was rough and babyish. But Northern knew what he heard. The creature had just spoken. Moreover, it had this hoarse ring to its tone like he also did. Northern groaned heavily as he forced himself to stand up. He couldn't still bring himself to stand straight, bending as he took a step closer to the creature. He raised his hand and touched the creature. "Hey, son," Northern said, feeling himself a little hit. His gaze lingered on the being for a while as he tried to think of a name. Northern then suddenly remembered something similar between the creature's nature and a certain word from his former world. He then continued, "Your name shall be Black Mamba from now on." The creature lowered its menacing eyes to Northern and said roughly, "Black Mamba." Northern smiled smugly and nodded his head. "Yes, you get it. Black Mamba. Now, Black Mamba, it is time for you to fulfill your first assignment." Northern slowly retreated to his seat and snapped his hands. Immediately, Black Mamba disappeared from the Void Palace, instantaneously appearing on the rooftop. The Emperor was about to jump off in pursuit of something when he suddenly froze for a second. He grimaced and slowly turned back. This time his teeth were gritting and his demeanor carried an almost palpable air of discomfort, compared to before where he didn't seem bothered. Before him stood a being which he couldn't make out. What was it? Human or monster? It felt completely different from any human or monster he had ever encountered. And this man right here had encountered a lot of monsters. Both stood silently, gazing at each other. The first, Black Mamba, appeared dumbfounded and deadpanned. Then, as the seconds ticked by, an expression of realization slowly crept into his facial features. For the first time, Black Mamba frowned. The kind of tense, discomfort smile that the Emperor had on. "What are you and who sent you to me?" the Emperor inquired as he lowered his leg into a profound martial arts stance. Black Mamba stood indifferent, tilting his head sideways as he observed the Emperor. After a moment of silence, he responded, "Black Mamba," with a slight speech impediment. "What an odd alias. I'm not one to talk too much, but I will make an exception for you. I don't know what you are, but I perceive you to be a strong person. However, I can tell that you have an insane amount of potential." He breathed in, breathed out, and continued, "I will kill you. If you think you want to save yourself right now and give yourself more time to grow before facing me, then I will allow you to go. And I'm only saying it once." His voice was as defined as his words. However, all Black Mamba did was tilt his head right and left like a curious puppy. The Emperor sighed, "I guess that's your answer." Then he vanished. Before Black Mamba could blink, the Emperor buried a punch into his torso, causing his entire skin to ripple. There was a slight delay as the force amounted and settled in. Following that, the plates of the rooftop disintegrated under the intense force as Black Mamba rolled, spinning as he flew away with that punch. He crashed into the next building, and the entire thing trembled, cracks running through all of it. The Emperor's frown got darker. He looked at his smoking hand and muttered, "It hurts." He didn't know what exactly had happened, but punching directly at the strange creature's skin made his fist hurt. He was sure he had landed a very powerful blow. At the same time, he was unsure what had happened. He averted his gaze from his hands as the building Black Mamba crashed into began to tremble. The Emperor narrowed his eyes, but suddenly they widened as something drew a quick black line, drawing his attention. Black Mamba was there, above him, floating and slowly coming down, and scathed. Chapter 436. Black Mamba, Part 2. The Emperor's gaze sharpened, his muscles tensing as Black Mamba descended from the air. There was no sign of damage on the creature's body, no indication that the powerful strike he had delivered had made any impact. This puzzled the Emperor, a man who had felled countless adversaries with his bare hands. For a moment, time seemed to stretch as the two stood in a silent standoff, the night around them thick with an air of impending violence. The Emperor's brow furrowed in concentration, his combat instincts flaring as he tried to anticipate Black Mamba's next move. But there was something disturbingly unpredictable about this creature. The intricate white lines on its obsidian skin pulsed with rhythmic energy, and the circle on its chest seemed to throb in sync, as though drawing power from some unknown source. Then, without warning, Black Mamba moved. The creature's speed was unimaginable, a blur of black against the night. The Emperor barely had time to register the movement before a fist as hard as iron struck his side. The impact was like a thunderclap, resonating through the air with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city below. The Emperor's eyes widened in shock as pain lanced through his body. He staggered back, a wicked grin spreading across his lips. He wasn't given a moment to recover. Black Mamba was relentless, pressing the attack with a series of rapid strikes, though the Emperor was accurately blocking his attacks with one hand. Before Black Mamba's fists could land, the Emperor's defense was already in place. Each blow was precise, calculated, and delivered with the kind of efficiency that only something not bound by human limitations could achieve. Yet there was also a savage, primal energy behind each hit, as if the creature was testing its own strength, discovering its potential in real time. But yes, all the blows, no matter how fast, strong, or precise, were met with the Emperor's brutal defense. As the onslaught continued, the Emperor's grin widened, a feral gleam in his eyes. He had faced countless opponents, but none quite like this. The thrill of a true challenge coursed through his veins, igniting a fire that had long lain dormant. With a sudden shift in stance, the Emperor launched his counterattack. His fist shot out like a coiled viper, aimed at Black Mamba's midsection. The creature twisted, narrowly avoiding the blow, but the Emperor's other hand was already in motion. Connected with Black Mamba's jaw, the impact reverberating through the air. Black Mamba reeled back, its head snapping to the side, but it managed to brace itself before sliding off the roof. For a moment, it seemed stunned, but then its eyes locked onto the Emperor with renewed intensity. The white lines across its body pulsed brighter and began to change, forming sharp edges like a zigzag pattern. The circle in the middle of Black Mamba's torso shifted into a lightning shape. Suddenly, Black Mamba lunged forward, its arms stretching impossibly long. The Emperor's eyes widened in surprise, barely managing to duck under the elongated limb. He felt the rush of air as it passed over his head, the creature's hand grazing his hair. Taking advantage of the moment, the Emperor surged upward, driving his shoulder into Black Mamba's chest. The creature let out a hiss of pain, its body bending backward at an unnatural angle. But instead of falling, it used the momentum to flip over the Emperor's head, landing gracefully behind him. The Emperor spun around, his fist already in motion, but Black Mamba was ready. It caught the Emperor's wrist, its grip like steel. For a moment, they were locked in a contest of strength, neither willing to yield. The air around them crackled with energy, the very atmosphere seeming to warp and twist. With a roar of effort, the Emperor broke free, simultaneously delivering a devastating kick to Black Mamba's midsection. The creature flew backward, crashing through the wall of a nearby building. Debris rained down, dust and concrete filling the air. For a moment, all was still. The Emperor stood, his eyes fixed on the hole in the wall. Then, a low, rumbling sound emerged from the darkness. It started soft, almost imperceptible, but quickly grew in volume and intensity. Black Mamba burst from the rubble, its body now covered in a swirling, inky darkness. The white lines on its skin glowed and then, whoosh, it moved with impossible speed, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. The Emperor barely had time to raise his arms in defense before Black Mamba was upon him. Its fists were a blur, striking with a force that seemed to defy physics. Each impact sent shockwaves through the Emperor's body, threatening to shatter bone. Finally, one last blow sent the Emperor flying off the roof, crashing to the ground, yet landing on his feet. The Emperor cocked his head to the right and then to the left, releasing his clenched fists, folding and unfolding them, repeating the motion a couple of times to ease the tension in his joints. Then he fixed his eyes on Black Mamba as it floated down. All the other nobles didn't need to be told before they fled the area as fast and as far as possible. Black Mamba softly landed on the ground and slowly walked toward the emperor, who now began to overflow with a crimson-red aura. It had the appearance of flame but none of its properties. It was like clean water burning like fire, and it subtly shifted the atmosphere. At first, it was unnoticeable, but suddenly some soldiers who had gathered to help the nobles began to collapse, even though they were over 400 meters away. Even older nobles who were masters, savants, and sages felt it equally, though they had the soul capacity and mental fortitude to withstand the damage it did to the lower ranks. But that didn't mean the strain was any easier on them. In fact, they couldn't help but wonder how vicious and devastating the pressure would be within 100 meters of the emperor. The emperor looked intensely at Black Mamba, who had stopped in its tracks as the pressure began to dry out the air. The environment felt hot and vaporizing. I gave you ample opportunities to walk away, but still you chose to throw your glorious life away. How foolish! The emperor groaned, malice dripping from his voice. Chapter 437. A Paragon, Part 1. Northern sat in the embrace of the void, feeling everything unfold. He wasn't seeing what was happening directly, but he had a sense that registered in his memory the things that Black Mamba was experiencing. This was why he could sense the fear that crawled into Black Mamba's body at that moment. The creature stood frozen, trembling with a profound sense of inferiority. It was as if it had realized, in that single moment and without having to come close to the emperor, the vast difference in power between the two of them. And Northern could feel the same realization. Black Mamba had an amazing ability, the ability to adapt. Northern knew it the instant the lines on its body changed, and its speed was boosted incredibly. The creature had a body manifested to adapt to anything that was thrown at it, perhaps even surpass it. However, it was like a newborn infant. It needed time to grow and evolve. Northern had hoped for nothing extraordinary by throwing the monster into the battlefront with the Emperor of Luengard, a paragon at that. First, he wanted to buy time. Second, he wanted to see what the Emperor was truly capable of. However, all of that might not matter because all the while, the Emperor had been playing with Black Mamba while Northern thought they had started a serious fight. The pressure the Emperor was exerting insinuated that whatever he had been doing before now was probably child's play. Black Mamba was probably not going to survive this if he didn't step in. However, he looked down at his gaping side. One side was open, the other was closed. The knitting process had passed halfway, and he was sure he would be fully healed very soon, although he couldn't say the exact same thing about his stamina. He was currently expending it to keep the chaos thread functioning. He had an insurmountable amount of void essence. However, his stamina left much to be desired. Northern breathed slowly and heavily as he anticipated what was going to happen next and thought of a way to stop it. Should I just send all my soul and void summons? Aside from the fact that it was not possible, Northern didn't think it would make any difference. The pressure, he could feel its threat despite not being on the surface world. He felt like his head was shrinking. Lower-rank monsters would probably die under it. Killing a monster with just the presence of his soul essence. Damn it, I really underestimated the might of a paragon. Northern mused. He had always heard that they exist on a different plane than all the drifters, even an ascendant, but he didn't really believe it, because Afcon was an ascendant, and Raven, a savant, came back alive. He had almost thought that all the soul ranks were probably shifty representations of all. But what a paragon is shocked the hell out of him. On the surface, the blazing crimson aura that surrounded the Emperor suddenly disappeared. In that moment it felt like the world froze, then the blaze returned. However, it was only occupying his feet, up to his knees, blowing madly like a piece of ragged cloth swaying in the wind. The Emperor's ivory skin had darkened, like the remains of a body after it was severely burnt by flames. The blackness had not spread all over his body but instead spread in patches here and there. He took a step forward, and immediately, his feet burned into the ground, turning it into molten magma that slowly eroded deeper. The Emperor removed his blazing legs from the magma. Despite it boiling and spilling, his leg was unaffected. The next step he took was the same, and he continued walking forward like that, leaving footmarks of molten magma. Black Mamba stood frozen until the Emperor reached his front. It was so overwhelmed by the Emperor's might and fear that it didn't know it had zoned out. So when its eyes regained awareness of being, they widened with shock. The Emperor, with a stark, smile-ridden face, hurled a kick from below, smashing it into the creature's head. A sickening, bone-crunching sound reverberated in the air as Black Mamba's neck broke. He oscillated in that position before smashing into the ground. The Emperor, with the stark, smile-ridden expression, raised his leg up and slammed it down. But a black blur flew across the air microseconds before his leg decimated the entire ground and sent debris, large chunks of rock, flying into the air. Black Mamba landed on the ground, tumbling and rolling away, unbalanced as it had put up its insane best to rush away from that attack. The creature's sense of survival probably clicked, and it realized that if it didn't avoid that attack, it was probably going to die. And simultaneously, inside the limitless void, a similar realization also hit Northern. He touched his heaving chest, drops of sweat running down his pallid face, his eyes frozen on the ground. There was no way at all he could survive a confrontation with a paragon. If he decided to fight the Emperor fairly, he was going to die. That was certain. Which was why he was not going to fight him. Well, it's not like I intended to fight him at all. The dude came out of nowhere and burrowed a hole into me. Northern felt frustrated thinking about it. How could he not have retaliated? He's practically on life support from one punch. He sat back and settled. Well, I don't have to fight him. I can just let him know I am his sister's son, and he should let me live. Raven is the one he needs to confront. Northern was at peace with his line of thought. At the same time, he was quite conflicted because his intuition told him that whatever scheme was going on with Ruffsburg messing with the rifts in Stelia, the Emperor of Luingard was certainly a part of it. Chapter 438. A Paragon, Part 2. The Emperor's feet continued to blaze viciously. Each step he took closer to Black Mamba scorched the ground to its very depths. Black Mamba scrambled a bit on the ground like a wretched beggar, struggling to stand up, but its movements were marked by haste imbued with fear. The creature staggered back shabbily upon successfully getting up, its face fixed on the Emperor's malevolent expression. There was no shred of mercy in those eyes. In that moment, Black Mamba learned what true fear was. Its body froze and cowered under the intense pressure, registering in its mind that there was no way it was going to survive this. However, the creature's response was unexpected. Instead of submitting to the fear that resonated even within its soul, the creature slowly straightened its back and glared back into the Emperor's eyes. This was not just a glare. It was the same malevolent glare that the Emperor was exerting. Something was ominously similar about both their glares. The Emperor himself could tell, but it didn't seem to change anything. Whether or not this creature before him had gained the resolve to stand beneath his searing pressure, there was only one certainty that existed right now. Death. Black Mamba's. Suddenly, the Emperor's eyes widened, then creased into a frown as he slowly mumbled, "How?" Black Mamba's feet, in the next moment after mirroring the Emperor's bloodthirsty glare, flared up in dark flames, almost as terrifying as the Emperor's. The flames intensified and began to scorch the ground, but the molten magma was not as pronounced as the trails left by the Emperor's sweltering legs. The Emperor narrowed his eyes for a bit, and time seemed to stop, giving space for movement as the Emperor took another step. What looked like a single step linked into a blitzing blur that exploded with crimson aura. Black Mamba, about to move at that point, suddenly froze, its face pale and eyes trembling. At that moment it learned something new: pain. The creature had no idea how it had happened. Its body was probably created to be insanely hard and malleable. Malleable in the sense that its ratio of defense could be proportional to the strength of the assault. The creature inherently knew this and didn't seem to care about blocking attacks during their initial exchange. However, when things got serious and fear began to register into its void soul, it began to dodge, making hasty judgments to run away from an attack rather than take it head-on. which was what it had wanted to do before the Emperor performed what seemed like a miracle. Moving before actually moving. The Emperor's brows creased as he saw no blood. "As I suspected, you are a strange being," he deadpanned, then added, "Well, it means nothing. You should have listened to me. You're an adversary I would have loved to battle when you had realized your peak." He shook his head and clicked his tongue pitifully. "You have thrown your life away." He pulled his hand out of the creature's body, spread his fingers, and lunged them forward. He stopped midway through his attack and strangely pulled his hand back with a slight frown. The blaze on his legs reduced, as did the patches of blackness around his body. They peeled off and crumbled into the air before touching the ground. He grimaced, almost gritting his teeth as he turned his head halfway to take a clear look at the person behind him. You didn't die." Northern, with a straight face, nodded. "It'd take more than a single punch to kill a resilient survivalist like me." "Ho ho!" The Emperor sounded amused. His expression changed a little as he turned away from Black Mamba to Northern. "I'm sure that punch must have burrowed through your belly, if anything." He paused to examine Northern, who was clad in dark metallic armor, from head to toe. To the Emperor, Northern seemed perfectly fine, like he had received no blow. The white-haired boy raised his hand in an attempt to make himself as approachable as possible, quickly saying, "I am not your enemy, nor do I want to fight you." The Emperor's expression did not move an inch, despite Northern's peace proclamation. Instead, he glanced back at Black Mamba and then focused on Northern again, asking, "What is your relation with this thing?" Northern looked at Black Mamba, who had a gaping hole in its belly. "Damn, he did a number on my boy." He tried to keep a rational expression without letting any of his thoughts show as he answered the Emperor. "While I wouldn't call him my minion, he's sort of something that my talent ability allows me to be able to do." "Do you take me for a fool? Talent ability? You don't even have a soul core. Miraculously, you seem to be advancing in soul rank like every other drifter, but you are just an empty shell." His statement caused Northern's expression to change immediately. A grim frown broke out on Northern's face. Such words, spoken in their barest form, were like spears piercing through his heart. Northern had actually forgotten that he was not like every other person. If it wasn't for the system, he wouldn't even have powers right now. When he awakened, he had no soul core, and therefore no talent. But the system came, he absorbed his father's talent by chance, and his journey began from there. He had no reason to feel like he was a powerless nobody because the truth was that he had unlimited potential when compared to every single drifter with a soul core. He might be weak now, but even without trying, he was bound to stand at the peak of the world. Northern's brow was seriously furrowed together. The statement that came out of the Emperor's mouth carried so much disdain. Obviously, this man-beast was looking down on him. And after everything he had been through, suffered, and endured to get to this point, Northern didn't think he wanted to be looked down on again, ever in his life. He looked down at the only thing his eyes could see. "I was really not interested in flame-type abilities, but it looks like there's a uniqueness to his. Plus, the ability of a paragon is bound to be very sweet." Northern licked his lips. "I might not be able to whoop his ass, but using his own ability, I'll show him I'm no slouch. Do you want a copy talent? There's Ember, S rank, 2000 talent fragments." Northern didn't actually think he wanted to spend so much on just one single talent. He wanted to diversify, to share the amount of talent fragments he had to copy different talents. And honestly, he was looking at one certain person's talent, the Tower Sage. That barrier thing that the guy had pulled, Northern liked it. But he wasn't exactly in the mental state to have copied it. He had just seen his birth mother and didn't even know if the system gave a notification to copy or not. He wasn't sure. But now that he thought about it, he really wanted it and the many more things that the Tower Sage could probably do. But right now, all of that did not really matter much because he was going to make this man right here eat his words. Both of them stood opposite each other. Simultaneously, a couple of things were happening around them. The two princes were watching from around the corner, observing what exactly was going on. Raven was long gone, in the wrecked embrace of the harbor, while Annette and the others were plummeting their way toward the harbor as well. As they got closer to the wall, soldiers began to gather around to defend their city. But their fine and sharp swords were no match for the savagery and brutality that the drifters had gone through in the wilderness. With vicious cries and boorish efforts, they plunged forward in reckless abandon, tearing through the soldiers to get to the ships, their faces full of madness and desperation. To these lot it was this or nothing. Gulliver stood above the wall of the palace, with binoculars in his hands. He fitted his eyes through them to see exactly what had caused the Emperor's thrashing to stop. And there it was, Northern was standing in front of the Emperor. Immediately, the binoculars fell from his hands, and his eyes widened in shock. Is he mad? Standing in front of the Emperor like that? Does he have a death wish? He was so surprised he didn't know he was voicing his thoughts out loud. He frowned and jumped down from the wall. The palace wall was half as tall as the main empire wall, and yet Gulliver let himself freefall. Just as he was about to touch the ground, his body came to an abrupt stop. A second later, he landed on the ground and shot forward like a thunderbolt. Chapter 439. Galahad Lewingard III. Galahad Lewingard III stood before Northern with a stark expression of blankness on his face. No trace of emotion could be read from his eyes. Northern matched his intimidating presence with an amazing level of confidence. Anyone present would call him cocky. He didn't know what he was doing. The Emperor is a paragon, a drifter whose sole rank has achieved evanescence. In modern terms, he was peak existence. At the very least, they were an embodiment of power closest to what should be the real peak. The fact that they had hit a great wall in advancement did not mean they were not strong enough to put gutsy brats like this white-haired kid in their place. The air around them was silent. The night was reaching its peak. However, the moonlight cast a brilliant luminance over the sky, making the night bright enough for anyone to navigate through the streets and see the havoc that had been wreaked by the flood. Northern was still vexed by the statement the Emperor had made. There had been no exchange of words between them since then. And honestly, when he thought deeper about it, he was vexed. Very vexed. You do know I saved your damned empire, right? Coming in that tone from a little-looking boy like him, the Emperor frowned darkly. You seem to have not learned manners at all. Much so, when you are standing before a monarch. If you wanted me to bow, don't you think now is a little late for that? You punched a hole through my belly and now call me a careless, weak drifter. Damn manners. Northern's tone was unapologetically dripping with disrespect. The Emperor frowned, but his patience was nearing its limits. Veins were bulging along his temples, and his jaw was hardening. No one would have taken such disrespect from a kid lightly, especially not the Emperor. The ground shook, and the Emperor vanished, streaking towards Northern with his essence blazing forth from his back like the propulsion of a rocket. His fist looked like it was tearing through the air as it hurtled towards its target. Before Northern's magnificent eyes, all this fell into a slowed series of movements. He was unfazed by the Emperor's speed. In fact, he was quite surprised. Did I overestimate him? It'd be disappointing if this is the best he can do. Northern easily maneuvered through the Emperor's fist, tilting his head out of the way. With chaos footwork, he looked like he was about to fall. But he simply twisted his body to roll to the other side. The Emperor was sure Northern would fall due to his desperate last-second maneuver. That's how anyone would see it. But to his surprise, Northern had bypassed him, appearing behind him. Simultaneously, Northern's eyes widened as the impact of the Emperor's fist against the air made their vicinity tremble, raising the ground forward with catapulted force. Reflexively, the Emperor twisted, his body blazing out in essence. Northern vanished from the Emperor's space, appearing instantaneously far away. His eyes still bore the vivid shock of the firepower he had just witnessed. Insane, crazy! Northern's mind screamed. He hadn't been chanced to see it the first time it happened. Now that he realized for real how much he had underestimated the might of a paragon. Of course, he wasn't just there brooding. Northern's feet blazed with a blue flame, instantly striking widened eyes on the Emperor's face. There was an obvious resemblance between Northern's ability and his. The Emperor could feel it with every fiber of his muscles. That was his ability. Northern grinned and bolted forward. The Emperor met him with a powerful block. The impact of Northern's kick smashing into his crossed arms caused the ground to shudder heavily. Cracks spread around for a second. Without giving each other space, they continued. Each of their blows was so powerful that it seemed like the force of impact was tearing the ground apart. Cataclysmic, loud sounds reverberated into the air with each thrown assault. Both of them were fast. So fast that even the savants and sages among the nobles could not see what exactly was going on. All they could see were red and blue flame-like streaks circling each other with showering sparks and intermittent tremors. So much so that the tower sage froze, his eyes trembling with disbelief. That is Lady Hinai's son? How is a child like him fighting like that with the Emperor? Gulliver was fascinated, beyond impressed, but he was also worried. The longer the battle goes, the more dangerous it is for Hinai's kid. Gulliver gritted his teeth. I have to step in somehow. He raised his head from the top of the building, and thanks to the damage the flood had done to multiple structures, it was pretty easy to see the harbor from his point. Several ships had been turned over, but 3 of them still stood gallant like gigantic beasts of the sea. His eyes traced down to the path where numerous ragged people were viciously tearing through the ranks of soldiers. Everything was in disarray. The flood had dealt tumultuous damage to the majority of civilians and knights. Many were situated in the noble district. The ones holding those people off had their morale at rock bottom. They probably didn't even know what they were fighting so hard to protect. He snarled subtly but angrily and looked around again. The princes, who should be doing something about the current situation, helping their father bring back order and organization to the empire, were secretly watching and probably waiting for a chance to strike their father. Everything that could go wrong with a country happened all in one night. Frustration boiled in his blood, causing him to fume. What exactly is their use when all they do is blame each other and plot against their father? Bunch of spineless rats. Unfit to lead. He cursed beneath his breath. But Gulliver also knew why they were so impatient and stupid. The Emperor was a paragon, still looking even younger than them. If care was not taken, they wouldn't taste the throne, and it would naturally pass to their grandchildren. Both of them had that fear that they might never understand what it means to rule a nation. Princes who never became emperors. However, that fear had totally blinded them. Too sad. I'm the only person who can see in this nation. Gulliver clicked his tongue regretfully and brought his attention back to Northern and the Emperor. He still couldn't help but be greatly astonished by how much Northern was holding his own against a paragon. A smile spread across his lips. Even if he's a bastard, the blood of Riemgard is the blood of Riemgard after all. Can't be compared to these fake blood bastards. Chapter 440. The duel that went down in history. The air crackled with the sheer power radiating from the 2 combatants. Northern's blue flames danced around him, while the Emperor's essence blazed like a crimson inferno. They moved at a pace that made heads spin, their forms blurring into streaks of color. Clash after earth-shattering clash rang out as their blows met, each impact sending tremors through the very ground. Northern continued with those lightning-fast kicks, which the Emperor met with unyielding blocks. The force of their exchange carved deep gouges into the earth. Suddenly, Northern saw an opening and lunged forward, his leg whipping out in a devastating sweep. The Emperor's eyes widened, but his reflexes were lightning fast. He leapt into the air, his body twisting with grace and precision, evading the attack by mere inches. Northern didn't relent, his onslaught unyielding. He pursued the Emperor, his movements a blur of blue and black as he unleashed a flurry of strikes. The Emperor parried and dodged, his essence flaring brighter with each block, but Northern's speed and ferocity kept him on the defensive. Just as Northern thought he had the upper hand, the Emperor's expression shifted. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips, and in the next instant, he vanished from sight, reappearing behind Northern with his fist already hurtling towards his back, all his movements leaving a trail of crimson essence. Yang! Of course. Northern's eyes widened, But he didn't panic. He pivoted on his heel, his own fist colliding with the Emperor's in a titanic clash that shook the very air around them. The ground trembled, cracks spiderwebbing outwards as the two titans traded blows at a breakneck pace. The exchange was a blur of motion, each strike carrying the weight of mountains. Northern's agility and the Emperor's raw power were evenly matched, neither gaining a decisive advantage. It was a battle of wills, a test of who could push the other further before the inevitable breaking point. The Emperor's eyes narrowed, and Northern felt a shift in the very fabric of the air. The Emperor's essence was condensing, coalescing into a singularity of pure, devastating power. Northern braced himself, knowing that what was coming next would be a decisive blow. The Emperor suddenly pulled back his head, sucking in air, and then roared. That roar, however, came with a devastating burst of flame that created a wave of fire, engulfing everything in its path. This flame was so intense that it immediately began to turn solid rock into molten lava. The entire area was bathed in the warm radiance of viciously hot flames. The nobles felt the hot blizzard threatening to throw them all away. Even Gulliver had to use a barrier to shield himself from the attack. It was insane and crazy. His face paled as he watched it happen. The building he was standing on was even assaulted by the strong force of the wind, forcefully pulling down the mighty edifice without a shred of mercy. However, Gulliver was unaffected. At first, he thought it was the sure end for Northern. Then he looked closer with a narrowed expression. The flames had surrounded him from all sides, so he had thought that Northern was being burned alive. But just a moment's glance granted him the opportunity to see the white-haired kid standing unfazed in the flames. His face and hair were now covered with a vicious helmet, giving him an even more devilish presence, a black shadowy cloak dancing off his back. He couldn't help but exclaim silently, "What are you?" Even though he wasn't being touched by the flames, thanks to the void force of limitless void, Northern still felt the heat. Mainly because of the armor he was wearing, he had observed that the Night Terror armor was resistant against cold, but it was incredibly weak to heat. Although it held up a good front of defense, he was already sweating buckets. The flames stopped just in front of him, as if a wall of air was preventing them from burning forward. The ground in front of him had been turned into a seething pool of molten rock. He narrowed his eyes with a small smile and then moved, his body a blur of motion as he launched himself upward, twisting through the air with a grace that belied the chaos around him. The flames roared beneath him, their searing tongues licking at his heels but still not reaching him. Why aren't my flames touching him? The Emperor frowned at this strange phenomenon. Northern's muscles coiled like springs, propelling him out of the firestorm's reach. The Emperor's attack was relentless, a tidal wave of raw, fiery power that consumed everything in its path, like a living beast. Northern's eyes blazed with determination as he shot forward, his blue flames igniting around his fists as he hurtled toward the Emperor. The ground below, already fractured by their previous clashes, gave way under the intense pressure, the molten rock bubbling and hissing as it was pulverized by the sheer force of their battle. The Emperor's eyes widened in amazement. Until now, he had been wearing a straight face. However, in this moment, his expression changed completely. A mad grin adorned his face as he met Northern head-on, a flash of crimson essence bursting from his core. He seemed intensely happy, too happy, that it almost freaked Northern out. Magnificent! No one, not even my worthless sons, can impress me the way you do. Individually, you make me want to stop restraining myself. Their fists collided in midair, the impact creating a shockwave that rippled outwards, shattering the molten ground and sending chunks of rock flying in all directions. The shockwave tore through the surrounding landscape, flattening trees and throwing up dust clouds that obscured the battlefield. The Emperor seemed to be enjoying every second, but it wasn't that simple for Northern. Keeping up this much with the Emperor was taking the life out of him. He felt like he was at the edge of a cliff and could fall off anytime soon. Every second he fought two things at the same time, the Emperor and staying conscious. Northern twisted in the air and brought out his blade, his movements a seamless blend of power and agility. Blue flames cloaked both blades of the staff as he launched another series of strikes. The Emperor grunted, his muscles straining as he parried each blow with almost mechanical precision, but Northern's relentless assault kept him on his heels. He's parrying it with bare hands? Is he mad? Northern stopped abruptly. He had thought the Emperor would naturally pull out a weapon. He didn't mean to fight unfairly, but he was nearing his limit. He had more cards up his sleeves, but his stamina could take no more. And what had the man said a couple of seconds ago? He had been restraining himself. What would he be like if he wasn't restraining himself? Northern wanted to go crazy internally but kept a calm demeanor. He was weak and tired, feeling like he could faint any moment now. And the Emperor had this insane smile attached to his face, saying after a couple of seconds, "Come on, boy. Don't tell me you're getting tired when things are just starting to get interesting."